Like, it's just like whoever gets the most slaps in, they've won the battle and everyone goes home.
Yeah.
Red-faced.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
So a fixed war. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Flux.
And I'm Ben McKenzie.
Welcome to Pratchat, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast.
Each month we discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books with a special guest.
This month we're discussing Witches Abroad, a book where three of our favourite witches find themselves wandering around the Discworld.
And our guest is editor and bookseller Jackie Tang. Welcome, Jackie.
Hi guys, thanks for having me.
Right.
Thanks for coming in.
We got a pun before we even got past the intro. I mean, that's actually not that unusual. Yeah. Hi, Jackie. How are you? Sorry, that was I got off track there. I was excited by the pun.
I'm doing well. I can understand. I feel like I need to get my pun capacity up to be amongst you guys.
We don't even have a wand which is filled with pumpkins. Sorry, that was very bad.
Well, you do have the magic ability to turn anything into a pun, so I feel like that's appropriate.
Yes, well, we all have our superpowers.
And Jackie, you're a big Terry Pratchett fan.
Yes, I am.
I gathered that impression. And you have someone on Twitter was showing us their copy of the book, which was a very nice first edition hardcover, and you have the same edition of the book.
Yeah, so I essentially have a slightly addictive collecting nature, and during my uni days, the choice of my collection was going to be Terry Pratchett hardback. So I just went around online and bought a lot of secondhand books, many of them hardcover Terry Pratchett's. And then I gave my paperback Terry Pratchett's that I'd bought from secondhand bookstores to my friend's ex-boyfriend and never saw them again when they broke up 6 months later.
Duh.
I know.
It's deeply upsetting.
Yeah, I feel like I know, he probably appreciated them, so.
Okay, well, we'll imagine they went to a good home.
That's right.
And that if it wasn't a good home, they escaped.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And how did you get started reading Terry Pratchett?
So I started by just picking up Colour of Magic at my local library because it had that little red dragon sticker on the spine and really didn't like it, which is, I think, a familiar story amongst a lot of your guests. The wizards, the kind of jokes about high fantasy. Maybe I was too young for them. Didn't read them for a while and actually watched those animated TV shows that were showing on the ABC without realizing they were Discworld until many years later when I actually read the books. And then picked up Weird Sisters and loved it. So, yeah, the witches were my entry point into Discworld.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm glad we got you for the right episode there, didn't we? Fantastic.
Yes.
I'm glad you came back from Colour of Magic because I wonder how many people are out there that started, they're like, oh, well, it's not for me. And they're just out there with this perception that this is what the Discworld is.
Yeah, I think a few people.
10?
Oh, more than that. More than that. I mean,
11?
Scores of people.
Many lots.
As we've discussed every time this has come up, the Terry himself told people not to start with Colour of Magic, which I think is rough. I started with it. I loved it. I didn't get all the jokes. I hadn't read all of the things that it was clearly a parody of, but I enjoyed it. But, I see why a lot of people wouldn't. It is very different to the later books. I feel, although interestingly, as we might get on to, this book feels like it has a few things maybe in common with some of those early books, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I don't want to.
You got your precognition on?
I have got my precognition on. I'm currently answering a question that someone's asking at the end of the podcast. We do like to start with a reading of the blurb.
See, the blurb on mine is 2 lines, and it is, you can't fight a happy ending, at least up until now, which is...
That's pretty good.
That's succinct.
Yeah. It is quite succinct.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what the first edition's blurb is. It might be the same as mine, but let's find out.
Well, okay, the first edition's is, it seemed an easy job. After all, how difficult could it be to make sure that a servant girl doesn't marry a prince? But for the witches Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Og, and Magrat Garlic, travelling to the distant city of Genua, things are never that simple. This is actually a really long one. Yeah. For one thing, all they've got is Mrs. Gogol's voodoo, a one-eyed cat, and a second-hand magic wand that can only do pumpkins. And they're up against the malignant power of the godmother herself, who has made destiny an offer it can't refuse. And finally, there's the sheer power of the story. Servant girls have to marry the prince. That's what life's all about. You can't fight a happy ending, at least up until now.
Interesting, because mine is the paperback that sort of is the following edition of the book. And it has basically the same blurb, but with bits cut out. Oh. So it's like the middle couple of paragraphs are cut out.
My blurb is just the last line of your blurb.
Yeah.
As time goes on, just more gets
just cut
sliced away.
Maybe they just figure, look, everybody knows who Pratchett is. They're buying it because they know it's him. They don't really care what it's about.
Yeah, like this is an entire itinerary of what actually happens in the book. I feel like we've partway done the podcast already reading that blurb.
I think we talked about this in the Weird Sisters episode, but how do we imagine pronouncing the youngest witch's name of the three of them?
See, I say Magrat.
Yeah, I also say Magrat because it sounds the worst, and it's repeatedly talked about how her name sounds the worst. But you had a different idea there, Jackie, when you were reading the blurb.
Yeah, I always pronounced it Magrat in my head, but
or Magrat.
Magrat. Was it? See, I don't even know. It just comes out of me.
It's a weird name because it's not a real name.
I think it's one of those words that, like, when you're reading, your brain skims a little because it doesn't actually correspond to anything that you've heard in real life. So you sort of just make it up without thinking about what it sounds like.
It's a real problem with fantasy novels, in particular, is that they've got all these weird names in them. And you only ever see them written on the page. You don't know how you're supposed to say them.
Well, I went through years calling Hermione because that's how my dad said it was pronounced. And I was like, well, Dad says that's how it's pronounced. And so I'm correct. And I spent years correcting other people because now I'm an editor.
Wow.
But yeah, but I was the one who was wrong.
Oh, that's awful.
Well, maybe I'm not. It's subjective.
Well, it's also like those people who, pronounce foreign words that have come into the English language from a foreign sort of language in that foreign language's pronunciation.
Oh, like when people say croissant.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So if only we had some examples from the book of people doing this.
Now you've got your precognition on. But we should start at the start, I suppose, shouldn't we? How do we feel about the start of this book?
Does it start with describing the Discworld? I've forgotten because my brain immediately glosses over that, which is terrible, but it's because I've read it so many times. But I really liked the sort of ideas about the nature of stories, how they're not just stories, they're always happening, and how reality as a thing is being explored here. That was so inelegantly described just then, but it's because it's very elegantly described in the book, so me trying to sum it up is just like trying to shovel the dictionary into a pocketbook. But
yeah, I thought there was a couple of really clever things that he does at the start. I mean, he does set up that idea of stories, but one of the clever things I thought he did right at the start is the first footnote in the book, or maybe the second one, but one of the really early ones,
page 1,
is about urban myths. And I thought it was very clever for him to put that idea. Oh, yes, the second one is about urban myths, which I thought was really interesting. He put that idea in our head because later on he keeps talking about rural myths. It's an urban myth, but not in the city. That's great. I love it. And I thought it was nice that he sort of established that thing about urban legends. Although it's weird that he calls them urban myths because I've always thought of them as urban legends. And then when later on he says rural myths, I was like, oh, that's just because you didn't want to say rural legends. But no, he says urban myths as well. So there you go.
I also had a note that there's a footnote on page 1. I'm not sure if it's the same for all of your issues. On mine, the footnote's right there. And it's saying that science should focus on important things like catching that butterfly that keeps flapping its wings and ruining everything.
That's on the first page of mine too, yeah. But then we get that sort of little glimpse of what's happening in Genua, although we don't know that's where it is yet, with clearly some voodoo going on. But the voodoo in the book is very much, it's kind of bits of traditional voodoo practicing, but also some other sort of folklore and mythy stuff, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, I always felt like, I guess, reading this at a younger age and not sort of being as aware of it, even then I felt like he was dealing more with, I guess, popular conceptions of voodoo, just because he was also doing fairy tales as well. Yeah. I didn't ever take it to kind of be a commentary of real practices so much as stories about that kind of magic.
And it seems quite respectful in its way as well. Like, it's never like this is evil or weird or bad, which is one of the main criticisms of traditional kind of fictional depictions of voodoo, is that it's seen as a sort of form of black magic or evil. Whereas here, Mrs. Goggle, when we finally meet her, is very much depicted as someone who's kind of in that grey area. Like, what she does could go either way depending on what she does with it.
And they have that really good conversation between her and Nanny where they sort of present each other with the stereotypes of the kind of magic that each of them practiced. And they go, oh, well, I see your point, but also, yes, we do. Just a couple of zombies and just a few people into newts.
Yeah,
that was great.
I was calling her Mrs. Gogol.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So we're
going to have a fist fight at the end of how to pronounce all these things.
Well, I was wondering if she was named after the other famous Gogol, the Russian playwright.
I thought that was also Gogol.
Yeah, me too.
Well, maybe it is, and I don't know what I'm talking about. Again, I've very rarely had to say that
I'm a Goggle.
out loud.
It's supposed to be I'm
Team
a
Goggle.
Goggle.
That's right.
Yeah. That's fine. This is yet another Discworld book that begins with somebody dying. It's really like, is it getting old by this point? Like, how many books have started with somebody dying and failing to really properly prepare other people for what's about to come?
I just never tire of seeing death in a book. Like,
Yeah, no, completely. And I always love seeing Death interact with witches as well. So every time there's a witch book, I'm just like, yes, how is Death going to come into this one?
and she's just so like tiny-minded. Like, she's already got it all like dug up out in the backyard, and so her coffin's there, and then she's already made a plan with like the woodsman to come past on his way back from work to bury, because she doesn't want any like loose ends. And
Yeah, which is, quite a bit more prepared than the previous witch that we accompanied when she met Death. She didn't meet Death. She met Morton. She felt a bit ripped off.
but she left out some hay for the hoss, which was quite good.
That was nice. Yeah.
But yeah, I forgot to mention her name is Desiderata. Is that Desiderata?
Desiderata. Yeah. Which is the name of a famous poem.
Desiderata kind of did that thing where she's very prepared for death. She sent an envoy across to the witches' meeting to say, oh, I'm not going to be there because I'm going to be dead, because they're all up on a mountain having their sort of annual. Yeah. And so she's getting her death sort of things in order. And the one thing she hasn't done is train up a fairy godmother to replace her.
She's just like, what's his name from Moving Pictures, you know?
You got one job.
Yeah.
She's too busy out enjoying her life, you know, just traveling the world and writing up books about it.
Yeah, she does sound awesome. Like her book, like her house sounds really cool. Her life sounds really good. And everyone's like, what's this weird woman who goes around with all these cool things around her house? But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I also do like the way that she basically explains the backstory to Death, and he's just like, whatever. Like she has this like quite long sort of monologue where she's like, well, this is what happened, and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay. Nobody else knows that, and they have to find it out for themselves. That's a bit weird, but okay. But lets us know what's happening, which was nice.
Yeah, and she's left a letter for Magrat, who she's decided will inherit the wand, because we found out she just comes around and hangs out with her sometimes.
But also I think because she has that confrontation with Lilith in the mirror. So she goes to the mirror, she sees Lilith, and Lilith tells her, you've lost, because she's dying. And so she has to kind of think about a way to get, I think she says that she needs to use headology to get Granny and Nanny out there.
Yeah, because she's like, I've seen all three of them there, but I can't just tell them to go because then they won't go.
Yeah.
So this is my way of getting them to go. I'm going to give the wand to Magrat, and that's going to make them go.
And tell her not to take them, or tell her to tell them they can't go.
Yeah. And it's hilarious how easy it is to manipulate Weatherwax with a very bit of simple reverse psychology. But it's hilarious.
Yeah, which I love it.
Yeah.
So they decide to... So basically she dies, that all happens, and while they're at the Sabbat, was it?
Yeah.
They sort of go, we should probably go to her house and just make sure that her stuff's okay.
Yeah, but that also, at the Sabbat, that's when we find out there's only 4 or 5 witches left in the Ramtops, which is not very many, because there's Granny and Nanny and Magrat, but then there's also, now with the death of Desiderata, there's only Gamma Brevis and Old Mother Dismas, who... doesn't just have her precognition turned on like Mrs. Cake, but actually has it wandering back and forth. So you never know what part of the conversation she's responding to.
And she says quite a salacious thing, which you don't realize until you sort of go back through, because they said that she could be responding to anything from as far back as last Hogsmith or whatnot. But they talk about, like, they make this joke about what is essentially sex toys being brought back from over the thing. Yeah. And they all sort of try to imagine it. And then at the end, she describes what is clearly her using one.
Did I miss that?
Yeah, it was very. Oh yeah, it was very elegantly done.
What did she say?
She was like, "Oh, we were using it, and then a bit fell off or something." Like it was just.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We had one once, but the bit you unscrew fell off and got lost. That's right.
I was like, "Oh, this is like really quite some salacious stuff."
Wow. Yeah, I did not pick up that's what she took. That's amazing.
So I just sound like a really like prudish like. All boys school fashion. Oh, look, there's a titillating thing. But yeah.
You're like, Granny, you can't be having with those sorts of things.
Yeah, like, it's like my reaction to hearing the hedgehog's got a, what? No, I've just merged the two songs. I was like, the hedgehog's got a knob on its end.
Now that's a song. Just waiting to happen. Wow.
3 knobs, right?
Oh, but what's the actual
It's an echidna, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, no.
But they finish, they go to the cottage to look for the wand. And Nanny and Granny have that nice little sort of like argy-bargy where it's like, oh, I'm going to go. Well, maybe I'll go. All right, we'll both go at lunchtime tomorrow. And then they both turn up like
at
that night.
Dawn.
Oh, the crack of dawn, that's right. Yeah, they both turn up at the same time way too early.
And they can't tell each other off because they're both doing the same thing.
But it's not there. One's not there.
Yeah, and Nanny's not really looking for it. It's more Granny is looking for it. And then she catches a glimpse in a mirror and gets real freaked out. So
yeah.
Yeah, she punches it, smashes it.
Which kind of sets up this sort of mystery of what's going on with these mirrors and who is this person? Although it doesn't take too long before you kind of, I mean, I knew because I've read the book before, but it does sort of really heavily imply what's going on with this other person.
Oh, I saw Granny in the mirror. Oh, yeah, but it wasn't her. No, she's freaked out by this. And anyway, do you remember Granny's family?
And all these people remember you. Yeah. And there's an actual line in there somewhere that's like, families are funny things, and there's no context for it except that they've just been talking about Lilith, and you're like, hang on.
Yeah, it's very heavily foreshadowed, I feel like. But I think Cratchit does a lot of foreshadowing in this particular book. Like, there's, lots of little Chekhov's red slippers and things dropped around at the start of the book.
And then big things drop down on Chekhov's red slippers.
Yes, very large things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so Magrat eventually shows up, doesn't she? Is that what happened? And she's been not really participating in witch things because she has been trying to find herself, which Granny doesn't really hold with. And she's even gone so far as to send away to get a course on being a ninja from Lobsang Dibbler.
Yeah. For the way of the, well, because she started off with she's using the way of the scorpion or the path of the scorpion, but there's a footnote talking about the way of Mrs. Cosmopolite because the idea is that when you're seeking wisdom, wisdom is one of the few things that looks bigger the further away it is. Which I thought was a great gag. And I'm like, yeah, people, there's that mania where people like just go, yes, this is a secret from the far reaches of wherever. And you're like, oh, yes, well, it must be very important and smart. Then it's like, you don't know where it's from.
And just that weird image of like monks traveling to Ankh-Morpork to stare through Miss Cosmopolite's window. And she just thinks they're pervs, which they are.
Yeah. But I think she's probably used to that in Ankh-Morpork as well.
Yeah.
Because Mrs. Cosmopolite, the seamstress, who was working in Hollywood only a few books ago. So it's nice. It's one of those things where there's so many, by this stage, there's so many little callbacks to other books that if you didn't know what they were, it wouldn't matter. But when you do know what they are, you're like, oh, that's nice.
It's like bumping into your cousin at a wedding.
The other thing I liked in that section is that he talks about inspiration particles and how Magrat's really opened her mind so wide that her mind is the kind of mind that's just really receptive to them. Which is why she's got all these sort of slightly weird ideas that don't quite fit into the Discworld and certainly not the idea of witchcraft. But I also quite enjoyed the way in this book, like Verence is hardly mentioned at all.
Yeah, because they were going to live happily ever after. And then she decided, like, it's just the one line. It's like, well, no, two lines. It's she didn't want to be a sex object, which someone else says on her behalf. And then later when she's comparing variants in her mind to the duck or someone like that, she's like a hardworking prince who's like of a small town versus like this fairy tale sort of thing.
Yeah, who's all like blue eyes, like gemstones and stuff like that. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I mean, the end of Weird Sisters, it's very clear that things are not going to quite go in that happily ever after direction, at least not smoothly, because they're kind of not talking to each other. Kind of are like it's sort of a bit up in the air what's going on with them at the end of Weird Sisters. And so then for it not to be addressed in this book at all, I thought was, or hardly at all, I thought it was a little bit weird, because I never really, apart from those two lines, I never really talk about it.
I think it's interesting because it almost feels like Pratchett wants to have Magrat in like sort of give her like one last hurrah. Like I feel like he wanted a book where the three witches were just by themselves and he could explore the dynamics between the three of them without necessarily having her sort of sidelined into a royal plot or, you know, like becoming a queen rather than, you know, just being herself as a witch.
Yeah, I agree. Like, it's like he grew to like her so much he didn't want to just shut her in a box for storytelling.
Yeah, and it's only a couple of books later that it is her wedding. So it's maybe, he just decided, I want to do that story. I know what that story's going to be. But before we do that, let's send her off on this adventure.
Yeah, I think the strength of this book is definitely in like the dynamics between the three witches. And I feel like it's the one where you really get a sense of who they are personally and how they sort of relate to each other. So it's really interesting in the, I think, so... in that scene where Magrat, sorry.
However, there's no correct answer.
Yeah, I'm just going to wander here and there.
Very good.
So she comes and meets Granny and Nanny in Desiderata's cottage and basically says, I have the wand. Yeah. And she gave it to me, like, very meekly. And Granny's like, no, give it here. And she like does have that spine and she sticks up for herself and says, no, she gave it to me. But there is that one thing that she says where she's like, witches aren't hierarchical, in protest to Granny when Granny orders her to give it to her. And I was just like, that's really, I loved that Pratchett was exploring, because they're not non-hierarchical because they don't, you know, they respect everyone's position. It's because they're all like, they all have to think of themselves as the only one, right? They're solitary. So I felt like it's good that Pratchett was exploring that sort of dynamic where every one of them is that stubborn kind of woman who won't sort of like retreat.
Yeah.
But they're very different kinds of stubborn women as well. So like forcing them all to be together for like an entire book is just interesting to see how it sort of devolves and evolves as well. But through the fights and things that they get.
Yeah. But they do eventually somehow manage to get a plan together, which is that they're all going to go to this place, Genua, and they're going to try and fulfill Desiderata's wish, which is to stop the girl marrying the prince. Although they don't really know any more about it than that. And they don't get much of a... I mean, I think one of the things I realised rereading this book, I really enjoyed the trip that we go on and the adventure that happens. But for the first half of the book, the plot is not really present. Like, there's no real threat. Like, we're going to Genua to do this thing, and there's a weird presence in the mirror, but there's no, like, the stakes are really not established. I'm like, well, what happens if she does marry the prince? Like, I have no idea. Why is that important? I don't know.
So this is again where this is the first time I'm going to compare this book to Shrek, or Shrek to this book, because that stuff, the travel stuff, is kind of like the joyful bit that happens between Fiona being rescued from the dragon and them making their way to Duloc to deliver her for her wedding, and it's just the fun travel journey they have on the way, but paced differently, because for half the book it is just the fun journey. And yeah.
It's also kind of like those like 19th century sort of travelogues, you know, like people who, like the books that are about, I can't remember, like Lawrence Stern wrote one, but it's sort of just about people going to the continent, and every chapter is sort of like, you know, encountering a different sort of member of this new society and how that sort of opens your mind to kind of new ideas. Like, I feel like it's very much in that sort of vein of, like the 19th century Eat, Pray, Loves.
Yeah. And it is, I mean, it feels like a sort of ramble through a mishmash of just European stuff. Apart from the first couple of stops they have, which are very much a mishmash of more Middle Earth kind of stuff, as they find some dwarves in a mine with their secret invisible runes on the door. And
the Emperor's new runes.
The Emperor.
Yeah. How do you know they're invisible? You can't see them.
The wizard charges for them, so they have to be there.
Yeah. I thought that was great. And then and this is something somebody mentioned on the Twitter, just after they meet the dwarves and head on their way, they're in a boat when a weird frog-like creature swims up to them and says, "It's my birthday." And then they take one look at it and at each other and then sort of bonk it on the head and get the hell out of Dodge, and they're like, "We don't know who that was or what it was about."
I think maybe Nanny says something like, "Oh, it's a horrible creature," or something like that.
Yeah. And it
was just delightful.
There's often not that much Tolkien reference in the Discworld books, even though it seems like such an obvious thing to parody. And the dwarves sometimes have some, Tolkien dwarfish kind of traits. The elves are really nothing like Tolkien elves when they do show up. But this book's got those few moments that I just really liked that. That was great.
I guess it makes sense for this book because he's parodying so many different kinds of stories. Like that travelogue is, I guess, also, them kind of flitting in and out of different stories, from, spoiler alert, Dracula to The Wizard of Oz to, Huckleberry Finn even. Like he's really running the gamut of different kinds of parodies.
The Dracula one I do want to mention a bit because I don't think we need to spend too much time on the story of the trip itself, but there's just so many bits where they dip in and out. And the Dracula one was kind of weird because I'm like, where are they exactly? Because we know later on, when vampires show up as main characters, we find out a lot more about the country that they're from, which is sort of this, weirdly Transylvania-like place. But this is like one tiny little... it reminded me of Ravenloft, which is like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign setting that was invented so that you could take your Dungeons and Dragons characters basically into a Dracula story. It's this tiny little domain, mostly dominated by a castle where there's a vampire. It feels like they've wandered into Ravenloft, and this is exactly what would happen. The vampire, his name is Strahd. This is what would happen to him. He didn't accidentally get eaten by their cat, And I thought that was funny, but also just it's really weird. But then I got into it. It took me a little while to get into it, but I got into it.
But it also just gives us the great scenes of Nanny and Granny forced to share a room and share a bed.
Oh, yeah.
And Granny's just like that great traveler who, I'm not going to be holding with any of this foreign nonsense for the whole trip. She gets into bed with all of her clothes and her shoes on and all of that. Yeah. And was it she wakes up in the night and Nanny's eating something? It
was a garlic sausage?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's eating it in bed and then they throw it out the window. And then you hear their whole scene happen, and then you see it from the bat's perspective, where it's been hit by all these things. It's been hit by a sausage, it's been hit by a window opening, and then suddenly Grebo.
This is a story that they wander into and they really know nothing about. The witches are totally oblivious to what's going on. They don't pick up any of the signs, and they've clearly never read Dracula, for starters, but also they've never seen a Dracula movie. And they don't seem to know anything about vampires, which, given, later events in Carpe Jugulum or Jugulum, I'm pronouncing it how I think it should be pronounced in another language now, aren't I? But, they seem to know plenty about vampires then. So it seems weird that they don't put two and two together in this book. Maybe
they've read Desiderata's books in the interim?
Or maybe they know... the Uberwald vampires, and so because it's not Uberwald, they don't necessarily make that connection that this is what's happening. I think it's also kind of sort of hinted that a lot of these scenes that they're in have magic as well, that possibly they've been influenced by an outside party to kind of follow a very specific narrative
for the stories.
Yeah, and that's why people do things even though they don't really think about why they're doing it. It could also just be that Terry hasn't figured that part out yet.
He just wants to do a funny bit where they're going to get eaten by a vampire.
Yeah, he just wants to put a garlic sausage in there somewhere.
Yeah. But I really like that idea because they did say that some of the things, especially the Red Riding Hood one, is as someone's gone through and practiced their story making for their masterpiece, which is kind of what Lilith has done. So that could very much be it. That makes sense.
Yeah. Although this feels like it's more as a scenario rather than a story, because it's sort of the setup before the story happens and they wander into it. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking that now, but
it's also them kind of, they're the bicarbonate of like storytelling, right? So it's almost like, I guess, Terry's setting up from being a very small piece of bicarbonate to being larger and larger. Like they're also practicing their ability to stop the narrative.
Yeah, and also just in vampire stories, ignoring all of Buffy, usually it's men who defeat vampires. So like if there was a story happening in this, they wouldn't expect the two little old ladies and the young woman to come in and defeat it. They'd just be like fodder in the backstory. Also, just going back on that, what was it? They get called a mum and an old hack or something, and then Magrat and Nanny get it the wrong way around. Who are you calling a mother? Who are you calling
a maiden? That's right. Nanny's like, who are you calling a maiden?
That's right.
Which I thought was delightful.
That was great. I also really like when they're on their way in and they think they've seen a bat, and Nanny goes, "Oh yeah, I've read about this. It's deflabbergast." Like, what? It's this foreign for bat. Like, no, it isn't, Nanny. It isn't, but it's hilarious, is what it is. So that's a great little sort of aside. It doesn't really seem to have much to do with the plot, but that's fine. It was good fun.
I'd have read a whole book of that, to be honest, like of them just going to villages and wreaking havoc.
Yeah, there is one last bit I want to mention from this, which is when they're flying on the broomsticks for a while after they leave, where they sort of almost but not quite invent the first Discworld airline.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I thought was hilarious. Like, we could get a really big broomstick, like you could make it out of a tree, but you need one person to fly it. You need somebody else to, like,
greet them and
greet the people coming on.
Yeah, that's right. Nanny has to be like the cook, and then Granny's all, what would I do? And they're like, someone who can greet them and, tell them what happens when the broomstick goes down.
Yeah.
And Granny's just like, they'll die. It's like, well, they'll have to know how to die.
Yeah. That was great. I really enjoyed that. But then they get on the riverboat for a bit of gambling, as it turns out. And it just reminded me of that film Maverick with Mel Gibson.
Oh, that section's my favorite though. Like, basically, just to give a quick recap, Granny somehow loses all their money playing cards because she's clearly been hustled by card sharps. Is it card? See, I thought it was card sharks for a really long time, but then someone else is like, it's card sharps, and both make sense to me.
It's not card sharks?
Because that makes sense. Because they're like
it's
the
loan
shark.
shark and card shark. But I think it has, like, card shark has become a thing because of people mashing those two things together.
Okay. And sharks are sharp. They're pointy.
Yeah.
Yes.
And apparently their skin is really rough.
Sharp's also not a noun. I just feel like it doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this on the Dodger episode.
The imagery of card sharks is just so good though. Like just swimming around waiting for chum in the water to get like someone like Nanny in there. And so to get their money back, and also because she's angry and she's been wronged, Granny goes in there and plays the old woman who doesn't understand what's going on. So she goes in and this is again some good like signposting. He like talked about the mirror, and I was kind of like, why is she describing the mirror? And she sort of gets a deck of cards, and then suddenly these guys go, "Oh, would you like to play with us?" She's like, "Oh, I don't really know how to play, so you nice young men will teach me, won't you?" And yeah.
No, it's quite amazing. And she destroys all their cheating mechanisms. Like she makes the mirror smash, and the guy's mechanism up his sleeve, which like he suddenly goes, "Ah!" Casually springs like stabbing him in the arm. Crumpled bit of cards coming out of his sleeve.
Because Nanny and Magrat are really worried she's going to use magic to win, but she only uses magic to stop them from cheating.
Yeah.
'Cause she's actually just very good at cards.
Yeah.
So, and this is like the first look I think we get at a detailed game of Cripple Mr. Onion.
Yeah, you get a bit more sense about how it works in this section.
Did you have any real life kind of alternatives to what you thought that game is?
It's like poker, but with like some happy families, like things thrown in the side.
Yeah. It's very much about it is about making a good hand and getting a set. But the hands are much bigger. Like, because at one point someone's like got 9 cards on the table. But there's ways to. It's clearly very complicated. And it's got that great bit at the end where he's like, "Oh, I've got a perfect onion," which is like clearly like a full house or well, it's like the equivalent of a royal flush,
Or 13 Wonders from Mahjong, which is it's a real rare. I've only got it once, and it was the best moment of my life, bar none. All my loved ones listening, that was the best moment of my life.
Wow. Okay.
But yeah, it's like the amazing hand that is so hard to get. basically, that you pretty much, it's unbeatable. And they've gone all in or something like that. And also for broomsticks.
Yeah, because
Nanny lost her broomstick.
Nanny,
Oh,
I find it hard to believe Nanny, like, that was one bit of that book where I was like, I understand that one of you's got to do this for there to be the amazing payoff of Granny's amazing gambling, but I would have thought Nanny would be a good gambler and not gullible. She's a witch for starters.
But has she been drinking a little? Because I feel like...
Non-stop.
Yeah, like they'd been guzzling down the absinthe.
Yeah, at Pamplona, but not really.
Yeah, and I feel like she's probably just continuing that through all of their different stops.
And I also have another theory, which is that Granny, she's confusingly described as sort of credulous and innocent, but she doesn't come across that way at all because she's like very knowing in lots of other ways. But my theory is because she's so respected by her giant family, she might think she's good at gambling, but I feel like her family would let her win at all things because she'll get angry or it's disrespectful not to. So she's probably, it's like playing the same person in chess all the time. If they're worse than you don't get better. So she probably thinks she's good at games. When she's playing against someone who doesn't respect her, then they're not letting her win.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, he's got his perfect onion.
He's like, you can't do anything about that.
And he starts grabbing the chips and stuff towards him.
And she's like, I can if I can cripple it. And you're like, whoa, now we know why it's called Cripple Mr. Onion. Wow. Oh, so good. So good. After that debacle, they're like, well, they're probably going to be quite angry because Granny wins lots of money. Like, I think Nanny only loses about $17, but then Granny wins like 70 or something. Like, it's loads of money. So they decide we should probably leave. They're going to be angry. And they fly off. And then they get closer to Genua. And this is where they start running into stories that are more traditionally fairy tale. They spot a castle, but there's something not quite right about it because it's covered in ivy and cobwebs.
This is the section where they obviously go into the castle and everyone's asleep and we start seeing Granny kind of, get really annoyed at everything that she's seeing. Like, I think she takes it very personally.
Yeah.
And they start talking about how this might be a Black Alice job. And I always love, like, the mentions of Black Alice in the Witches books because they're always just like, oh, she wasn't that bad and, she just ate one or two children at the end.
Just went a bit
really
funny at the end.
Yeah, she just went a bit funny,
Yeah.
And they
terrible.
shoved her in her own oven. That's not good.
Yeah, terrible thing what happened with that oven. And we also start seeing, I guess, the theme of the book in that section about what's magic and what's real. And I think this is where Granny starts getting really angry that things have to be real to matter.
Yeah. And there's the thing about the Black Alice job mentioned too is that, Granny sort of hints she goes, or someone like her. And then when they wake up the people in the castle, they all recognize her or they think they do, which is, again, another big tip off that who is this person who's been doing this stuff and why does she look like Granny Weatherwax? And of course, if you've read the book before, you're like, why, but it's still...
And they recognize her angrily. So they chase them out of the castle even though they're the ones who sort of wake them up.
This is also one of several times in the book where they use the actual witches use the word psychology. I'm like, if you know the word psychology, why do you keep calling it headology?
There's headology and psychology. Doesn't have an extra G?
They also use psychology as a noun because they talk about someone having a psychology. Well,
Nanny says Granny has a psychology.
Yeah.
Which she does.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But they free the people from the castle. They just throw the spinning wheel out of the window and smash it to me pieces.
They're lucky that they didn't summon Glod doing that.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Sorry, how do you think they know how to short circuit these stories? Is it just that they've heard these stories so many times that they know exactly what to do? Or do they do a bit of magic to kind of figure out which story they're in?
I think there's two things going on. They talk about how witches have a really good sense for stories, almost like they just know how they're supposed to go, even if they've not heard the story told. But also the way that Terry describes urban legends in that footnote right at the start really kind of suggests that, well, these things really do happen. And there's a couple of times when they talk about these things where Nanny's like, oh yeah, I heard this happened over in Skund and blah, blah, blah. And like, we know that people really have been put to sleep in a castle before. Like Black Alice has done that. Those things really do happen, but they don't necessarily happen to you. You sort of hear about them happening 2 villages over in the same way that you hear about, oh yeah, like this cousin a cousin of mine has got a friend whose uncle said that this thing happened to his ex-girlfriend. Like, the same way that urban legends are always about someone just sort of out of your reach. But I think these things really do happen on the Discworld, and that's how they hear about them.
Yeah, I just wonder, like, if someone were to set a trap for the witches, they could just configure the story so that doing or getting rid of the central object in the story actually like sets off a chain of even more disastrous things.
It's really good that you're not a fairy godmother.
Yeah.
Because this book would have been very different.
We've figured out a way around it. No, that is interesting though. And I think there's also this sense that the stories know how they're supposed to go. And you can only push them out of shape so far before they fall apart. But that doesn't mean someone couldn't find a way to do that.
And it's also the really interesting thing that sort of pops up progressively more as the book gets towards its conclusion, that both fairy godmothers think of themselves as the good one. Like Lilith doesn't understand that she's like, Lilith is, from our perspective, the bad one. But from her perspective, she's the good one.
Does she not understand it though, or is she just trying to use the story to make herself the good one? I kind of got that impression that she knows full well that what she's doing is evil, but she's put herself in the story in the position of the good one because she's the fairy godmother who gets the girl to marry the prince. But she knows that's not what she really is. She's manipulating the story to make herself into that role.
I think she thinks she's good, and she thinks she's doing the necessary evils for the greater good. But I don't know.
I think she is thinking that she's good because at some point she says something like, in 100 years, it won't matter that she doesn't want to marry the prince now. I think she has that kind of like long-term view of wanting to make the best story for for people in the future.
She's like, the bigger picture is that this story goes ahead. Everyone is happy and ordered in this village. I think I always bring it back to Brave New World, but like the people who came up with the echelons of society where everyone's brainwashed to think they're happy to fulfill their function in society, they probably think they're doing good because everyone is arguably happy. She's doing the same kind of thing in Genua where everyone is forced to look the right role and do the right thing. Big picture wise, she thinks it's good even if a few individuals are unhappy.
Well, it reminds me actually quite a lot of a Doctor Who story called The Happiness Patrol, which would have been on TV about 3 or 4 years before this book was written. It's very clearly a parody of Thatcherite Britain, but it's a colony that's been established where being sad has been outlawed and everyone has to be happy. And it's headed up by this woman named Helen A, who forces everyone to be happy. And if she finds out that you're not happy, that's a crime, and she puts you to death. It's a very similar idea in that, she wants everyone to be happy. She thinks that's what the point of life is. And so she can just make everyone happy by executing anyone who doesn't conform to all the things that she thinks is going to make people happy. And Lilith is doing the same thing, but with her being a fairy tale kingdom.
And it's similar again to Duloc and Lord Farquhar and Farquaad. I don't think it's the same thing with Lilith, but he's trying to create a stable society that conforms to his idea of happiness, irrespective of how unhappy that makes people to do that pantomime. It looks on the surface very good and nice, but everyone's deeply unhappy to make it good and nice.
Yeah.
It's like that thing where you spray paint the grass green and all of that and it looks nice, but everyone's got paint inhalation.
Yeah. Look, before they get to Genua, though, they encounter a few more of these stories, more advanced, practiced versions, I suppose, of what Lilith is trying to achieve in Genua.
Basically, the 3 witches meet a little girl in the woods. She tells them that she's going to be visiting their granny, and Granny and Nanny are both like, oh, yes, of course you are. And so they go ahead to the granny's house. And then so they're waiting there for the wolf. And then when the wolf actually comes, it's this really horrifying image of a physical wolf that's trying to walk on its hind legs. And all it can do is sort of like howl, like in a vaguely human way. And when Granny actually, looks into the mind of the wolf, she realizes it's a predator that thinks it's a human, and it's horrific because he thinks he's 2 things at once, which I think is, one of like the most emotional parts of the book. Actually really brings like the reality of how horrifying magic can be if it were to be like implanted into the modern, or not into the modern world, but into the real world.
Particularly mind control magic, which is so often the basis of fairy stories. Everyone's being enchanted and charmed by magic all the time. And when we look at that through a modern lens, and we're like, well, people's, ability to choose and their free will is being taken away, and they're being forced to be things that are other than who they are. It's affecting their very identity, and that's like kind of really horrifying.
And there's a side point where Magrat's getting progressively more irritated that the other witches don't use magic, and she's like, we should use magic more. And Granny's very adverse to that, and I think this is a kind of moment that shows what Granny's afraid of with using magic too much.
Yeah, particularly because we know that she could do all this stuff if she wanted to.
Well, she has done it once. There's like another side point that once someone, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wilkins annoyed her, and she made him think that he was a frog.
Yeah.
But she didn't actually make him into a frog. So there's something kind of like a very fine line there for Granny, where it's like you can't actually change the thing on the outside. You shouldn't kind of split their identity like that, because it's not sustainable.
Yeah. And I got the feeling too that doing that to a human is not as horrifying as doing it to an animal, because an animal, they talk about how the mind of a predator is a very sharp, pointy, simple thing. Like it just knows things. And at one point they also describe, like the mind of an ant, which is just like pick up this thing, carry it over there, pick up the other thing, get into that sandwich, like stuff like that, which I thought was hilarious. But that animals have very simple, straightforward minds, and forcing them to think like human beings is horrible for them because their brains can't handle it. Whereas going the other way is sort of insinuated to be weird and maybe a little bit cruel, but not that awful. Like, because Mr. Wilkins recovers after a little while, and then he just likes swimming.
Yeah, they just build a pond in their house.
Yeah. Which I thought was cute. And they sort of go, yeah, he's got a whole new lease on life. You're like, oh, good. Yeah.
But this wolf, he's been like this for a few years, and it's very sad. And of course, after that's all resolved, after Granny's hit him with the frying pan, I think, the huntsman shows up because that's the story. And yeah, it's just really sad because like she can see how tortured the wolf is, and the wolf just really wants to die.
Yeah.
And he even like lays his head down on the block, and it's just really very sad.
Yeah.
And she also, I think, afterwards talks to the woodcutter. He says, oh, yeah, this wolf's been around for years, and this old lady's been living in this cottage for years. And she's like, why didn't you visit?
Why is she living out in the woods far away from the
exactly.
village? I thought that was a really good question. I'm like, why does Little Red Riding Hood's grandma live on the other side of the woods from all the other places, all the other villages? Like, it's not
in this
okay.
decrepit house that she can't clean because she keeps thinking everyone's there is like pixies to help her, and she keeps trying to give them sources of rancid milk to clean it.
That's the impetus for that really big fight between her and Magrat, because as they leave, Magrat's like, oh, isn't it lovely that, they did end up helping the old lady, and actually Granny's like threatened them with like her version of the horseman's word, basically for humans. But yeah, they get into it. Magrat says like, what's the use of being a witch if you can't do magic? And Granny says something like, oh, what makes you think you're a witch?
Oh,
like,
it gets real nasty, doesn't it? Yeah.
There are burns being thrown around.
And Nanny's just trying to mediate because she knows that this can cause big rifts.
It's really difficult for her to keep the peace because that argument goes really quite deep. Particularly Granny saying nasty things about Magrat, but Magrat also trying to say some nasty things about Granny. She just doesn't have the right ammunition, I don't think.
They find themselves walking through a field and ignoring each other, Nanny in the middle, and then suddenly a house drops on her.
Yeah.
Yep.
What? Now,
Excuse me.
I had totally forgotten that this happened in the book. And although I kind of, when she was wearing the red boots at the start, like it was Chekhov's red boots, I was like, oh, something's going to happen with those, isn't it? But I'd forgotten about this. And I found it really interesting because when I was reading it, I didn't twig that, the vampire section was basically them visiting a vampire story. I just thought, it was a weird European place to go, in the same way as they end up in that sort of Spanish kind of place where there's the thing with the bulls, as they describe it, which I thought was great. But I found it a bit odd that the Wizard of Oz in here, like this is a book that was written, a little bit over a century ago now, I think, if I've got my timelines right. And it doesn't, I never quite think of it in the same way as I think of other fairy tales. And And yet, in things like Once Upon a Time or any of those stories or like fables, which are about fairy story creatures sort of all getting together, it's often included, but I feel like it's kind of its own thing. Did you find that weird, or did you think it fit in pretty well?
Yeah, actually one of my notes, which I've highlighted as being like a super note, is Wizard of Oz not a fairy tale. And I know that not all of it is fairy tales, but I did find its inclusion really interesting. The thing that I love about the book that's not part of the film, which I think changes the story entirely, is that the Emerald City isn't emerald. It's just a normal city, but they make everyone put on emerald glasses before you go in because it's going to be, too dazzling. Your eyes can't deal with the glare. But actually you're wearing emerald tinted glasses so that it looks emerald to you when actually underneath it the reality is mundane, which is kind of what's going on here. Like Lilith's magic is making what's a normal town not what it is. It's like the emerald tinted glasses, but on everything. So I don't think that's why it's in there, but I just found that an interesting sort of parallel.
I don't know. As you said, it's not all fairy tales, although this particular section is. But also we're moving into Genua, which I feel like is like maybe Pratchett kind of wanted us to transition from like these woodland sort of stories into the stories that kind of take place in a grand castle in a city. And this was sort of the Wizard of Oz is with the Emerald City is kind of a mythical way of talking about a city. So I felt like that transition was okay. But I agree, like it's not a fairy tale. Not sure. I guess it's a children's classic, which is the closest that you can say. And something like Peter Pan, for example, is the same kind of story where it's very clearly written in, not too long ago, but we still incorporate it into our modern myth. And has Christian Andersen as well. Like his stuff is considered a fairy tale, even though he wrote it in like the 1800s, I think.
Yeah.
So
is this a deliberate trap to stop any other witches coming to Genua? Because it's a story about a witch who gets killed, and it also sets up a good witch and a bad witch. And I feel like there's kind of an intimation that that's the case in the way that Lilith sort of is a bit angry that it hasn't killed any of them.
Is that why Dorada sends 3 because 2 are expendable?
Oh, wow.
Wow. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, that's very... I can see Desperado doing that.
Yeah.
Because... Yeah, Nanny's only saved because she has that super epic fancy hat that was unnecessary. That's like got all of the built-in things that protected her.
Reinforced willow or something, which I really want to see what this hat looks like.
Oh, yeah. I really enjoyed the bit too where just after she's been hit on the head, like she's saying things and Granny's like, she's rambling. And he says, no, I ain't. This is my normal talking. I'm like, yeah, that is your normal talking. Don't you go changing, Nanny. Yeah. Oh, and the dwarves who are like, singing the song.
Ding Dong song. They're just coming home from work and they're like, that's this again. We got compelled to sing the Ding Dong song.
Yeah.
And can we have her shoes? That's the other thing.
And they're like, what do you want with them? And like, drink out of them? I don't know.
It's like in Harry Potter, how around the Triwizard tournament, they set up appointment like things so that if you're a muggle approaching you remember you have an appointment, you go away.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, this is a bit more direct.
Yeah.
Drop a house on you.
Yeah, like as soon as they step into something, it's like triggers all of the stories and they start like cascading down on the witches. Or Lilith is just so crazy that she's done this to like multiple villages in the entire circumference around Genua.
Yeah.
Like she's just got a
amazing.
wolf in every forest or every 100 square meter of a forest.
Oh, that's very upsetting.
Yeah,
the idea
I
of
think,
that.
but I feel like she would be the kind of person who would do that.
Just all directions, cover all bases, all the practice.
Well, I guess she'd need to as well, I guess, because if you want to have a magic kingdom that's made up of all the fairy stories, well, they can't all happen in the city because not all fairy stories happen in the city. A lot of them happen in the woods. You've got to have a nearby woods. You've got to have wolves roaming them.
What's happening in their water? Because like, we don't even get to see that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if it's near, I don't think Genua is near the ocean, but, if it was, presumably people would be catching those magic
Mermaids.
wishing fish all the time and meeting mermaids. Yeah.
Ladies turning into seals.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Women distributing swords as a system of government.
Yeah.
Moistened bints.
How much better would life be if there were no weapons like ever invented and things like, and just medieval battles were just people slapping one another?
With herring or something? Like just with fish.
Like he's just like whoever gets the most slaps in, they've won the battle, and everyone goes home.
Yeah.
Red faced.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
So I fixed war, and now
Thanks. Yeah. They should just have a dance-off. It should just be a massive dance-off.
That was an aside.
It's the book. I
Yeah.
feel like this book is the lack of plot up until this point.
It just feels. But the wolf. Sorry, just jump back. That just it got me in a weird place. I was like, I'm not supposed to feel this emotional in a book. But yeah.
What? Well, yeah. I mean, you wouldn't expect it for the bit that's about a wolf that's killing people. But I agree. I felt more emotional about that than most of the other parts of the book.
Yeah, I think the cost of the magic kind of really comes through in that scene. And because animals are so, we're conditioned to sort of feel like animals are just themselves, or they're a little bit helpless, or, that humans tend to ruin things for animals. I think that really hits us pretty closely.
But it's after that and after the Wizard of Oz house incident that they finally make their way to the city of Genua.
Where they're almost not let in because they're a bit grubby. It's only because they're holding brooms and thought to be cleaners that the manager lets them in, essentially.
Yeah. And as usual, Nanny is the one who seizes the moment and is like, yeah, we're going to pretend to be cleaners. This is not a time for pride, Esme. Let's get in there.
And no one treats them with respect because they're used to having a certain amount of respect as witches, but people jostle them and all kinds of stuff.
And that's a recurring theme actually along their journey, that people don't know what witches are.
Yeah, and witches don't know what steak tartare is.
It's true. It's true. But yeah, they get in and it's super clean. It's like the middle of the city is all these gleaming white towers. It's all beautiful and pristine. There's all these guards in their beautiful red and blue uniforms who look like much more smart than the ones in Lanka. And they're kind of impressed, but also there's something that feels a bit off about the place.
I think Pratchett here is really good at describing that offness, just little lines like when they're admiring the guards and Granny says, and there's so many of them too. Or talking about each of the towers as being a perfect repository for a captive princess.
Right.
He's really good at getting to that hint of violence about this city that could turn against you if you weren't the right kind of person in the story.
And they come across that thief who they think is going to get his hand cut off, but is going to get his head cut off. Is it?
Yeah. She's like, oh, that'll stop him. Well, he will never think about stealing something again.
Does he get killed?
Oh, I assume so. I mean, Granny doesn't intervene as far as I can tell.
But then at the start of the thing as well, there's this is going way back, but I think another punishment that Lilith meets out is sending the toy maker into the dungeons that she's cleaned up and is now just full of mirrors. And I never really figured, you can kind of guess what happens to him, right? That his sort of soul kind of is fractured and generating her power, but it's sort of never made exactly clear what her punishment is. And I feel she's probably got a lot of different kinds of ways of dealing with people. Yeah,
because it's intimated that, there's an innkeeper who's sent off for not being jolly and red-faced enough, and then we meet his replacement later on. But it seems like he just gets exiled or possibly executed. But yeah, you're right, it's not clear. And I was a bit confused about that too. I was like, is that not where she puts her mirrors? Aren't they just for her? Because it's never really said what she uses them for aside from her own mirror magic, and that seems to be all about amplifying your personal power at a cost. So it wasn't clear how you would use someone else in that. So yeah, I don't know. I was a bit uncertain. But Granny doesn't do anything about it because she's distracted, because she realizes two of the people watching the execution are not people at all. They're creepy sisters, and they are creepy. I love how creepy they are in this book.
They're done very well because, we all know what the Cinderella sisters are like as well, because it's no matter which one you've read or what movie you've seen, they're always bad in a different way. And it's just, this is an entirely new take on them that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. They're really sinister. They're like the gentlemen in that Buffy episode.
Because they don't talk.
Yeah. Or some kind of AI almost. They're relentless. They're the Terminators.
Oh, yeah.
And they just pop up silently.
But also, I felt it's interesting how he sort of doesn't say explicitly what they are, just like he doesn't say explicitly what the duck is either. We're saying the duck because we're pretty sure that's how everyone says it, but it is spelled D-U-C, so possibly it's supposed to be pronounced Duke. I'm not really sure.
But they make like jokes about like, oh, duck, but he's a like so that sort of fed into my pronunciation of it as duck.
Yeah, but it made me wonder like whether I was misremembering the book because they kept talking about the duck and I was like, the duck, and it's like, oh, he's the prince. The duck is the prince, but he's a frog, right? He is a frog, right? And I was like, he's a frog. And again, like with the sisters, it's intimated that she's turned them, into people from something else. And I'm like, they're snakes, right? I'm remembering this right. Like it seems very clear that that's what he's telegraphing, but then I was like kind of half expecting he was going to turn that and do something else, but then it was much more satisfying when that's what was going on.
Because I first thought it was mice because I'd conflated what they were being fed with what they were, but then I think snakes was better. Can I just quickly say how much of a shit I did not give about Ella at any point in this story? I was like, you can marry them. I don't care about you.
She's
whatever.
Hardly in it. Again, the stakes were not really set that high for her. I mean, she seems obviously she doesn't want to marry the duck and she's not keen on it, but we don't really know her or what her story is.
But that's very much like the Cinderella fairy tale itself. Like the central character is sort of not really that important and very rarely has the interesting psychology.
Yeah.
And it's like the Disney Sleeping Beauty. Like you don't really get any idea of her personality.
Yeah. But at least, Cinderella is the main character in her own story. Whereas here, Ember's like...
Emberella.
Emberella.
Something you put up in the rain.
I did like that they both came up with that separately.
Yep.
But
yeah, that was cool. But yeah, she's not the main character in this book by a long shot. So she's like very minor character in the larger story of the book. And as they point out when they discover that the Duke is, a frog turned into a prince, there's two stories going on there. They've been sort of smashed together. But that's not. It's also not quite right. Like that's not how the story goes. Like the prince gets turned into a frog and then gets turned back. Like that story doesn't really match up. And there's threads of these different stories, but she's really just sort of cobbling something together from all bits of story to make a new story that goes the way she wants. Well, that's how I read it anyway.
And I think it's also just like every little bit of the story that kind of follows a narrative path or narrative expectation feeds into her power, right? Like, so for her, it makes sense to kind of like put as many stories together as possible because it like creates that hub of storytelling power that is Genua. But so is this the part where Nanny's also wandering around the city and she meets Mrs. Pleasant? Who is, and there's like this great description of the food of Genua, which I was really into because we've had like all of this, what was it? Crap Suzettes and all of like these horrible Nanny and Granny just like going, oh, what is this? Do you have a pickle or do you have like some relish? And this section we get like a really great description of the culinary cuisine of Genua, almost like an Anthony Bourdain style no reservations tour. They drag everything up out of the river that they can get, and they don't bother with meat from anything with 4 legs. That's not interesting at all. They eat lobsters and crawfish and bivalves, I think Nanny tastes. And I feel like it's very apt that Nanny's the one who's like wandering through the city, and Mrs. Pleasant's guiding her, and that's how she gets to know the city itself, because that feels like something Nanny would do, that she would get to know a place by like just eating everything in it.
Yeah, totally.
And the food also gives us a really good idea of like the occupying force that Lilith is, because they have a culture beforehand. Like they had a baron, he wasn't nice, but they had their own sort of functioning society with their own food. When Lilith is there imposing her fairy tale ideas on it, even the food's different, and she points out that it's just like it's not creative. She just like puts the thing on a spit, sends it out in a feast, and like that's not what they eat in the kitchen. But that I thought was an interesting way of showing like on the level of the people who live there what's happened as well.
Yeah. And I love the descriptions of Mrs. Pleasant's cooking powers as well. When she's talking about that difference, because she's like, there's only so much you can do with big lumps of meat. Okay. But then she's talking about she's got some fish heads in a bowl that it was technically rubbish, but she was going to do something to them that would have made like Anthony Bourdain want to have second helpings. And you're like, oh wow, yeah, okay, amazing. Yeah, so that's because basically Genua is New Orleans. It's drawing on a mash of other things, but that's basically what it is. With this weird magical kingdom imposed in the middle of it, which at times, and it's never quite described in those terms, but it feels a little bit like Disneyland.
Yeah.
It's got that kind of, it's certainly the kind of place that would be in a traditional Disney film.
And it's a good juxtaposition of like the gleaming white towers and then like that sort of rambunctious chaos of the swamp and of like the kind of cuisine, the New Orleans sort of culture that he's drawing from.
Yeah. And the fact that the swamp is right next door to the city as well. Like when they go to visit Mrs. Goggle, it's right there. Like, so there's gleaming towers, there's slum city, and then there's, or regular city, and then there's swamp. And it's all right next to each other. It's all mashed up together. But that's where Mrs. Goggle is. Mrs. Goggle is,
Mrs. Google.
Mrs. Google. Well, I guess, this is people in Genua probably when they have a problem and they need to know the answer, they just go and goggle it.
Yeah. Terry's precognition right there.
Had it switched on very well.
He did. But yeah, that's that meeting where she, Nanny and Mrs. Goggle are really like talking about the stereotypes of each other's practice, which is, really delightful. I really enjoyed that.
And then Granny shows up because she's spotted Grebo outside, hasn't she, as well?
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Magrat is off meeting Ella. So they're all sort of getting their things happening. And then Nanny and Granny go off to the swamp, is it?
Well, Magrat is in the house with Ember and they're wondering where she's got to. And the sisters arrive home silently and it's very menacing and creepy and they're going to get her. Although it's not quite clear what they're going to do with her, whether they're going to eat her or something. But clearly they mean no good. And Nanny and Granny show up to save her because they've figured out where she's gone and what to do about it. And I quite like that because there's a couple of little bits of this book that reminded me of Doctor Who. There's a bit where they're going to escape from the sisters where Granny says, when I say run, and it's such a traditional Doctor Who line to say, like he's always going, when I say run, run, and he's getting ready to do a distraction and she just throws something up in the air and the snake sisters like watch it and they take that opportunity to scarp her. The other Doctor Who reference is when Grebo selects the cat mask for the ball and says, always wanted to be Ginger. Echoing the feelings of the 10th Doctor, who, soon after regeneration, comments, I wanted to be Ginger, I've never been Ginger. The Doctor Who episode premiered 15 years after the novel was published, leading us to speculate that Terry's descriptions of old Mother Dismas's mind being unanchored in time were written from first-hand experience. Which is when they kind of figure out, okay, we've got to disrupt this story. We've got to disrupt it really seriously. What can we do to mess this story up? And they kind of go their three separate ways to do their three separate parts of that.
Just before that as well, when they meet Mrs. Goggle, out in the swamp, like we also meet the Baron, right?
Oh, yeah, we do.
Yeah. He's at that point called Saturday and he's a zombie.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's great because Granny sort of like very tentatively kind of accepts him and she's very polite and stops him from going out to the alligator who swallowed her hat. It's like, oh no. And
she gets a replacement hat though.
She does, yes, a very beautiful one.
This is Google's best hat.
It's also the part where the revelation happens that we've all sort of guessed by this point usually, that Lilith is Granny's sister. Because, Mrs. Google's like, well, she knows who she is. And Granny's like, yeah, she's my sister. And it's great because she gets so personal about it. Like, she gets really angry. And we don't really see Granny as, like, this kind of, very human, very vulnerable sort of person. And this is also, I guess, one of the first times where we see more of her backstory, which kind of, leads my imagination to all sorts of different places. Like, what were their bedrooms like,
Bunk beds?
This is something where she says it's her sister, but because you never hear about her sister before or after this book, like it just doesn't become a thing. I was kind of, in the back of my head, I was like, have I totally forgotten where there's some revelation where it turns out she's not a real sister, but when Granny Weatherwax was a young girl, she tried using mirror magic and accidentally split herself into two. one of whom was good and one of whom was well, they were both the same, but because now there was two of them, one of them had to be the good one. And I was like, is that what's going to happen? Is that why Nanny's never heard about this? Is that what's going to... And then it doesn't happen. Like, it's just, no, she's actually just her sister. But
That'd
I thought,
be great.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think I was kind of going along that line because I'm like, well, otherwise, why do they look so much the same that everyone can confuse one for the other? When, most of the time, brothers and sisters don't look that much like each other. They have a family resemblance, but you don't go, oh, you're your sister. Right? That doesn't happen that much.
Because they would say twin if they were twins.
Yeah, because they're not twins. And you never really find out which one's older either, I don't think. Although it's sort of insinuated maybe that Lily is meant to be the slightly older one.
That looks younger because she hasn't got all the concern that people who are worried with good are.
Yeah.
Being good makes you look old.
Yeah.
Beauty tip from Terry Pratchett.
I thought that maybe that was where it was going to go. It's still a cool idea that she's got this sister that we don't know about but again, we never really get to know her that well. I enjoyed this book a lot, but I found it a bit of a disappointment in comparison to the other Witches books in some ways. Like the central three characters are great, but the plot of the book, I just never felt like the stakes got high enough and the threat was really there. Like it was great that there's this really personal connection with the villain, but it was never like parts of the villain's plot and parts of the villain's plan were really evil, but I didn't really know the people that they were affecting, so I didn't care as much. Like Ember, I'm like, I don't know who you are.
Yeah, and it's set in a totally new city as well that, we only really get to in the second half of the book. So I can see how like that would like drop the stakes, because it's like, well, do we really care if Genua kind of, comes under the thrall of Lilith for all eternity? Like we don't really hear much more about it after this. But I think it's like the book is very much Granny's book, right?
Yeah.
As most of the Witches books are.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, like the stakes are basically her personal ones. And because of that, we don't really get that, like it doesn't really climax until really the very, very end. Like that's when the emotional kind of punch of the story comes in, I think.
Yeah. And usually the trick for that is, like if the world's going to end, you don't really care because that's too big a stakes. So you put like somebody's, best friend or their cat or, their partner on the world that's going to end, and they have to save them from the end of the world. That's usually how you get those emotional stakes from a more personal thing. And that does work here, but I feel like it comes in really late because we don't fully understand the relationship between the sisters, between Esme and Lily, until that final confrontation where she says those things. Like we know that Granny is angry, but we've never met this sister of hers. We don't know why she's so cross about her. And I felt like that could have used some more building up. I'm being uncharacteristically critical of the book, but I think I really did dig it. There was just something about it that felt missing to me, and it was that sort of real connection to why do I care about this so much, apart from just that Granny cares about it. And I wasn't sure why.
See, I liked it as a book purely of putting characters I like in situations that were interesting. But in terms of having an overarching storyline that I was deeply invested in, I feel the same way, that I could have taken it or left it if Genua just sort of chugged along being in this thrall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to have read it.
Oh, yeah. I dug it. And it's got some great stuff. And I really enjoyed the way that they decide to disrupt the story of Ember's going to the ball and meeting the prince, because they really kind of use all of their strengths to get it done. Nanny shows up at the coach house. Oh, so we haven't even mentioned it's Mardi Gras night.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's fat lunchtime, as Granny puts it. And it's Samedi Nuit Mort. It's the big celebration, and everybody does their thing. It's been outlawed in the middle of the city, which is why the ball and meeting the prince is happening at the same time. Presumably, so that people will start remembering that as the thing that happens this time of year instead of the Mardi Gras. But the coachmen are pretty annoyed because they have to work. So she turns up with some rum. It's like, would you like a drink? Like, what a nice old lady. which is great. She gets
This
some
will
more
not
religion.
end badly at all.
It ends so badly for the coachman in a
It's
irreversible way.
Oh yeah, that's awful.
Because actually, we get to like the coachman. Like he puts in like all this detail about their lunches, and one's a newlywed, and they rib them about things. And Nanny shows up and gets them drunk. You're like, that's all really nice. But then in a throwaway line later, it turns out that when Lilith, so basically what's happened is they've sabotaged it. They've destroyed the dress. Like the coachman have gotten
Magrat's
drunk.
cut it up into little bits. They got the coachman drunk. Yeah.
And then they go off to enjoy fat lunch because they're like, oh, well, it's done. They can't go to the ball without all of this stuff. Lilith just like gleefully reverses all of it. She turns mice into coachmen. She turns the coachmen into cockroaches, which would have been bad enough. But then she stomps on the cockroaches.
Oh, so rough.
It's
a deeply upsetting book in some ways.
Really
Yeah.
awful.
And I think that's where I really was like, oh, she's bad.
Yeah.
Like, she's evil. And up until that point, I'm like, is she misguided? Is she really believes she's the good one? And at that point, I'm like, no, she doesn't really believe she's the good one. She's trying to make herself into the good one because like no one who really believed that they were doing the right thing would like turn people into beetles and squash them. Like,
Oh, but you could convince yourself. You're like, oh, they're going against the greater good, and I'm doing the right thing by killing the people who are threatening the story, which is the most important thing. Like in a warped way, you could still think you're good and do that because you're doing it in the name of the thing that is most important.
But she could also just let them run away.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's one of the things where she's kind of like sometimes I wonder if maybe Lilith just like does whatever she wants, right? Like that's kind of what Granny says towards the end as well, that she's always just done whatever she wants. So it's like the mood took her at that point to like squash the bugs. And she just doesn't think about what that means to like the people that she's just turned into those bugs.
yeah. And she's also, she's that evil mirror of Granny Weatherwax because Granny Weatherwax got annoyed with Mr. Wilkins and made him think he was a frog. She needed to get revenge because he said something that she didn't like. These coachmen disappointed Lily, but she doesn't just make them think they're beetles. She turns them physically into beetles and then squashes them. And it's like, whoa, okay, so you both have the same instinct, but one of you takes it way too far.
Yeah.
And the other one is a bit restrained. And there's a repeated idea in the book that there's not that much difference between the two of them, except that Granny Weatherwax decides to do what's really right, whereas Lilith does what she wants to be right or wants to think is right, that she gets something out of.
I have no doubt that she is evil. Like she definitely is. I'm just saying that I can see her twisting logic to still believe that she's good because with the Beatles, for example, great band, she could
Not squash.
she turns the coachman into Beatles. She goes, okay, that's the coachman dealt with. Now there's no longer coachman. Now there's Beatles. I'm killing Beatles, not the coachman. Like compartmentalizing everything.
Right.
Otherwise, she could have just directly killed the coachman.
Yeah.
So I think
Right,
she
yeah.
breaks things down into small, palatable bits that her conscience can accept as her still being good.
This is now your place in the world. You are now a beetle. Beetles are there to be squashed. Kind of thing. Okay.
So I think she can still convince herself she's good by compartmentalizing her behavior.
Sure. Okay. Well, one thing we haven't mentioned, that one of the other ways they sabotage the story is they turn the coach into a pumpkin, which is all Magrat's been able to do with the magic wand since she got it. I mean, she used it in the dwarf mine. She accidentally used it on the boat. And now she's used it for a useful purpose by doing the reverse of what the story normally requires. So, and they turn the dress in, with a knife. She turns the dress into just a bunch of rags, which is again like the opposite of the normal story.
And it upsets her because it's her dream dress and all of that kind of thing. She really does want to go to the ball as a person, but yeah.
But the thing that I found really interesting is that, Lilith undoes that really easily by going, oh, it's really hard to change the shape of living things, but it's pretty easy if they remember being something else. So she just turns the pumpkin back into, or non-sapient things. She says it's quite hard because to change sapient things, you just have to change their mind about what they think they are. And then if you give it a nudge, the bodies will follow. But non-sapient things are really hard unless they have some sort of memory of being something else. I'm like, well, then how come it's so easy to turn the coach into a pumpkin and all this other stuff into pumpkins in the first place? And there's kind of a little bit of an illusion later on that wand magic is special magic and it's powerful. But otherwise it says it's impossible to change the shape of a thing without like using sorcery. And I just thought, I think you're over-egging this, Pratchett. Like, it happens quite a lot in your books. And it is mostly people because he talks about the, morphogenetic field and all that kind of stuff. But, I just thought it was a weird kind of side note. But I did enjoy the fact that when she's getting ready to do it, she adjusts the rings on her wand because she knows how to do it. Like she's changing the settings. And it makes it sound like a pump action shotgun. I was like, whoa, okay, this is getting serious. This wand is going to do some real mischief. I like that a lot.
But once their sabotage is undone, the witches sort of start to suspect maybe their plan it was too easy. So they jump back into action. And I just love that the main part of their plan is to turn Grebo into a dude.
And it's kind of...
this is how to sabotage a coach that's in motion. We'll just turn the cat into a man.
Well, put the cat among the pigeons.
They do kind of justify it because like the coach goes past and Granny Weatherwax like, I could make the wheels fall off, which we've seen her do previously in Weird Sisters. Like, no, you can't do that because Ember's in there, you might hurt her. And they're like, can you get into the minds of the horses? And she's like, well, normally I could, but those are not horses. They're rats. And then Nanny's like, well, I know someone who could get into the minds of rats. And so they turn Grebo into a dude. He's like, you can handle the horses because you can fight them because they're rats, which is a very tenuous link to the plan. But it's
so good.
It does give us Grebo as a pirate.
It's a sexy part. I'm so glad that he wasn't like the same character he is as a cat, though, because he's just real... not good.
He's he's along similar lines, but he's like that Mills and Boone version of a pirate, where like yes, there'll be bodice ripping, but everyone's really into it.
Yeah,
so it's okay.
It's all consensual.
Yeah. He stops the coach, and does he kill anyone? I don't think he kills anybody.
He just drags away a coachman, and then like we fade to black, which is its own version of a Mills and Boone story, I guess.
And he does something, and Nanny throws a boot at him.
Oh, that's right, because he's gonna do something with he opens the cage door and it sees Ember, and she throws a boot at him. It's like, no,
because he's like, want.
She's like, well, tough.
Do we think Grebo would ever star in like a 50 Shades of Grey kind of story? I felt like, because I remember reading like something where apparently like lots of female fans expressed their like approval for this particular twist and him being turned into a cat. And also he gets described as like a leather, like what was it? He's
a leather-clad corsair.
Yeah, or something like that. Rippling muscles in a leather-clad corsair and like some greasy sexuality. And it was just like, I could see him like starring in his own franchise.
Yeah,
where instead of like doing bondage, it's just like batting like a large
just playing with like a fish on a stick or something.
Oh, he's got a giant like cat mate. You know those ones that they scratch for like human size?
This would be an amazing movie.
Oh, this is getting weird now. But
I don't know what you mean.
No, it's fine. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. The excuse for making him was a bit slim, but he's so much fun.
Yes.
I mean, look, and cats in human form universally seem to work pretty well.
Andrew Lloyd Webber made a name for himself out of it.
Well, it's true. And this book is coming out a couple of years after Red Dwarf started on TV.
Oh, right.
And I think there's a lot of similarities. I mean, Grebo is not nearly as vain as the cat in Red Dwarf, but there's a lot of other similarities between the two of them, although the cat does not like fighting nearly as much as Grebo does. But
there's a cat temperament, like, because Grebo is an alpha cat, like he is the one who beats up all the other cats.
Yeah, he's a tomcat. He's a big tomcat.
Whereas Cat from Red Dwarf is an indoor pampered cat.
A sushi cat. The kind of cats that only eat sushi.
Yeah.
And get photographed as sushi. Like, have you seen that series of pictures?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes.
It's some good stuff.
It's it's weird but oddly satisfying. So they need another plan now, because if Lilith finds out this is not going to plan, well, she can just do something about it.
So they send Ella to the swamp, and then they need someone to go to the ball in her place.
If only they had a witch who was sort of the same size as her,
and roughly the same age.
Yeah. Oh, Magrat's not happy about it. And she's not the same age as Ember though, because Ember's like 18 or something, but Magrat's like.
But more than Granny.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, much.
Oh no,
more
more than Nanny. I think Nanny was the one who was like, "Yeah, I'll do it. That's fine."
She's like, I fit the shoes and everything. It'd be great.
I think that was part of her convincing Magrat to do it. And then she does that thing where she looks over Magrat's shoulder at Granny and mouths like she hasn't got any confidence. And then that's when she says, "Oh, I'll do it." And then she's like, "Oh no, okay, yeah, you do it." And then Granny's like, "Magrat, darling, you look at me." and you're not quite sure what she's going to do. But then Magrat is really transformed. It's full on. And I don't think they ever say it explicitly, but it seems pretty clear that she's instilled her own confidence into Magrat.
I get where you're coming from with maybe Nanny was using it as a way to convince her to go, but I also think she was genuinely like, oh no, I'll go. Because in Nanny's head, she's still the same like 18-year-old who would go into a bar and all of the men would just fawn over her. Because that is still kind of what happens to her in Lanka. She's just got like adoring fans of family now. So, which I think is kind of great. Like her confidence is the same no matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But yeah, so they send Magrat to the ball dressed up as Umbrella with the mask on and with Granny's confidence installed. Grebo drives her up there. Meanwhile, Nanny and Granny take their brooms up to the top of the castle and discover the duck's bedroom.
Gosh.
His boudoir.
Oh, it's creepy, isn't it?
Yeah.
When they're looking around, they find the cover over the like hole in the ground. And Nanny's like, I seem to remember another story where the bride was told not to look in a particular room. And you're like, oh, yeah. Which is the story of Bluebeard's bride.
Oh, I thought it was Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, no, it's Bluebeard's bride.
Ah.
And it's like, it's not one that's often retold these days because it's frankly just a horror story dressed up as a fairy tale. But it's pretty extreme.
You know,
Rooms full of parts and things.
Oh.
For previous brides.
Yeah. It's like a slasher film.
It is, yeah. And so Bluebeard's actually kind of like Beauty and the Beast, right? Because Beauty and Beast is like, you get married to a horrible bridegroom, but he turns out okay. And Bluebeard's like the opposite, where it's, you might get married to, we might arrange you to get married to this guy and you might die, so...
It's creepy as... But anyway, they lift up the cover over the hole in the floor and it's not full of parts, thankfully. There's a pond down there. And the room is weirdly full of flies because he's a frog. He's a frog. He's still a frog on the inside, even though now he can talk. And I like the way that Lilith does mention that he's quite a smart frog.
Yeah. She's like, she picked the smartest frog in the pond.
Like, he's still a frog. Like,
How does she tell that he's a smart frog? Like, is it just like seeing...
The IQ test.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I guess
Psychometric testing.
Just gave him the Myers-Briggs. But I guess she looked into his mind in the same way that Granny knows how to do when she's burrowing and looking into the minds of animals.
Well, maybe she's just really good at telling riveting stories.
No.
Forget about it. Also, her name's Lily. Lily pads frogs. Maybe she loves him.
I always thought, is her name short for Lilith or is her name actually Lily? I was a bit confused about that.
I think it's an
Lily.
affectation.
Yeah, she's called herself something French and fancy.
Oh, yeah. Because the name that she chooses is like the surname is basically a French transliteration of Weatherwax. Yeah. So that makes sense. So it's just Lilith is like a fancy French version of Lily.
That's not a very good way to hide yourself, though. Like, I feel like if you're trying to, like, it's kind of like a Remus Lupin sort of situation. It's like, I'm technically a Weatherwax. Come find me.
Yeah.
But maybe she's doing like the Hyacinth's Bouquet thing where it's like her name but fancied up. So she's not trying to hide. She's just trying to be better. In her mind.
Okay. Yeah.
Because Granny hasn't gone looking for her in like 60 years. Like, assuming that Granny's about 80 or in her 70s and that Lily left when she was like about 18, I think is the... Or when she was a
younger.
teenager.
13.
Yeah.
She got thrown out at 13.
Yeah, so it's been like 60 years
Yeah.
and she's never gone looking for her and never mentioned her and never thought about her in all that... Well, we don't know if she's thought about her, but never interacted with her in all that time. So she's presumably not worried about people coming looking for her.
Yeah, I think she's fancying it up.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, I guess so.
Because her whole thing is the fantasy, the story appearing as different as to what you are. So
Yeah, and she wants to be like the kind of fairy godmother with lots of lace and sparkles and showers of silver and stardust.
Yeah. I just remembered that Granny technically must be younger than Lily now because of the time travel stuff that happens in Weird Sisters where they scoot like all of Lanka like 15 years into the future.
but still looks older because evil makes you young.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So that's weird, isn't it? Sorry, I just thought of that.
That is interesting.
It's one of those things where it's such a great plot point in the book that it's in.
Yeah.
But then if you start to think about how it must affect the things that happen in other books, you're like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Anyway, we're at the ball. Magrat's in there dressed as Embers, being confident, dancing with all these, fancy men. Nanny and Granny have entered through the roof. They've found that the Duke or the Duck is a frog, and also the Prince. There's a great line where he goes, "The Prince is a duck, there's a frog." But then they decide they've got to go down to the ball so they can keep an eye on things. So they do that classic move in any kind of infiltration film where they knock a few people out and take their clothes.
Yeah.
In this case, through hypnosis. And I have to admit, when I was imagining this, I could not get the image of Jennifer Saunders and Dawn French from Let Them Eat Cake out of my head. And I'm like, now I really want to see Jennifer Saunders and Dawn French play Nanny, Og, and Granny Weatherwax.
That would be amazing.
And I'm like, I don't know if they're quite old enough yet. I think maybe we need another 10 years, but...
Just enough time to get the funding together.
Yeah, so I think that would be amazing. I would love to see that. I don't know who you get to play Magrat.
It'd be like that Mamma Mia special they do. They could get Sienna Miller or something, just like some random blonde starlet.
Yeah.
The it girl of the moment.
Or they could get Jane Horrocks, who was in Absolutely Fabulous, who plays the voice of Magrat in the Weird Sisters cartoon. Oh. She could possibly do it, although she might be older now than we would think Magrat being. I don't know.
I kept seeing Grebo as Kevin Smith as Ares from Xena. Do you remember that? Yeah, like
wow.
the full leather, the weird.
Yeah, because he kept trying to get her to marry him, and
yeah, like just as sleazy.
Yeah, dangerous sleazy.
That's right.
Yeah, totally. No, I can see that. Yeah, but with claws. And
there'll have to be a
teeth.
Wolverine. Like there'll have to be a special effects budget, obviously, for this adaptation.
Yeah. That'd be great.
Doesn't one of the women that they've biffed and stolen the clothes of, Grebo comes across her, or is it Casananda that comes across her?
Well, Grebo comes across her first.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then things don't go the normal way that he expects, and she sort of goes, "Ooh, meet me in the garden later." And he's like, "That's not how it goes with cats." And then he does try to meet her in the garden later, but he's been turned back into a cat by that stage. So he's just rubbing up against her legs, and Casananda shows up and goes, "Hello, miss." You're like, "Oh, Casananda."
Casananda, the
also
dwarf is
Grebo
Casananda.
tried to make the date. Aww.
He's honourable.
Yeah.
I kind of like that he sulks off after it doesn't go quite well before, as in like when he's just met her, goes to the kitchen and gets fish heads in her and a saucer of milk and tries to lick his ears but can't.
Oh, poor old Grebo. I mean, look, he's also awful, but it was also great.
Yeah.
But it's also awful. he's both.
So he's a cat, yeah.
Yeah, he's a cat. He contains multitudes. But the ball sequence is there's so much going on there because the duck arrives and everyone's like, "Hey, it's the duck," and he's like, the crowd parts and there's supposed to be that magical moment where he and Amberella, who's Magrat, meet and they're going to dance the night away until she runs off with leaving a glass slipper behind. Although I quite like the way that they reveal that the glass slippers are not actually made of glass because that would shatter and destroy your feet. But they've got millions of tiny little shards of mirror on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
That's a good image.
they're like disco ball slippers.
Yeah, no, this is definitely...
But also, what is Lilith looking at?
What do you mean?
Because she looks through the mirrors at things. Like throughout the book, like she's looking from puddles and stuff, and now she's got these shoes covered in mirrors. It's like it's not awesome.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of that fable of the reverse floor thing, you know.
Oh, yeah. Well, look,
just to take it to a terrible place.
Yeah, I guess. Well, she could look out of any shard, so maybe she's not looking out of the ones that reflect upwards.
Maybe it's like a kaleidoscope, and it all just forms a nice pattern.
Maybe it's just so she can find the shoe when she needs it. I don't know.
Well, it's part of the story, so she probably doesn't need... Yeah, well, she knows...
Yeah, so she goes straight to the house.
Well, she already knows where the house is. And I quite liked that they expose that, after they disrupt the story. I mean, the first thing that happens is they're like, "Oh, but Magrat's not going to come around out of this hypnotized state that she's in, being all confident and dancing with everyone, including the duck, until midnight. Until the clock strikes midnight." And Nanny makes this great point. Clocks don't strike midnight. They just strike 12. We can make that happen early. And then accidentally dobs herself in. But by that time, she's met Casananda. And they've also had a bit of a dance. They both get approached by dance partners. And Granny's like, "I'm going to have a dance." And Nanny's like, "Well, I'll have a dance as well."
And Granny, learns to dance by looking in the guy's head and then steering too hard.
Oh, yeah. It's like, "Oh, he didn't try to lead for too long before he let her do it." But yeah, Nanny goes off to change the clock with Casananda's help. pushes it forward so that it strikes 12. And Magrat wakes up and realizes she's holding hands with a dude who's a frog.
Clammy.
Taking his glasses off. Because there's that nice thing that you can't change somebody's eyes. But they don't seem to apply that to the sisters because nobody looks at them and goes, those are weird snaky eyes. How come why have you got eyes like that? No one says that to them.
I feel like no one gets close enough to them to be able to see.
Yeah, you don't want to look them in the eye.
Yeah.
Because then they'll see you.
That's a good point. And so she runs off, leaving one of the slippers behind. And just as like Lilith's like, oh yeah, or Lily is like, oh great, we can do the story. Granny arrives and smashes it to 1,000 pieces. And Nanny makes that. She offers for her to try it on her. She's like, it'll fit me. And they're like, no, it won't. And she's like, yeah, well, there'd be hundreds of people who have the same size feet in the city. Like, the only way it would be like magical and amazing is if you knew which house to go to first. Which I thought was, that was a really
clever.
Interesting criticism of the original story, but also, real clever, Yeah,
I really like that part when Nanny's just like, the clocks don't strike midnight, because I feel like that's very in keeping with the witch's pragmatism, that they're like, no, that's not actually how the world works. Like, they know the story and they know the kind of figurative things that happen, and that's what like allows them to sort of see through it, to kind of know which parts they can jiggle and make the story fall apart. Like, and that's what Granny does as well. Like, she sees, like, she reaches deep down into the story and sees that the shoe is sort of like the totemic thing that disrupts it. I just thought that was cool witchery.
And it's Nanny messing with time again, because like in Weird Sisters, it was like her family all strangling the cockerel so they couldn't.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah.
I quite like too that, actually, I don't know if this is left dangling. Maybe I missed where it's not. But when they shatter the shoe and it's made very clear that she has derailed the story, there's a mention, it's just a short paragraph of the story like flapping about loose, looking for somewhere to earth itself. And I don't know that ever gets picked up. I mean, it's kind of a similar idea to what happens in moving pictures, where when Hollywood is destroyed, all these sort of bits of Hollywood stories like earth themselves in different moments, like with Detritus and Ruby in the cafe, and, Gaspode and Laddie being rescued from under the building and all that kind of stuff. But in this one, it says that's happening, but it's not clear. I don't remember that it actually is resolved, what happens to the end of the story.
Well, it's resolved because the sisters basically snatch Magrat and bring her back into the ballroom. And Lily takes the other shoe and she's like, you're so literal to Granny. She's like, you're so literal. Don't you remember that these things come in pairs? So she's got another she's got another one. That's what.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So while all that's going on at the ball, though, we've got Mrs. Goggle in the swamp doing her reverse voodoo. Instead of summoning a god or a loa to ride a human being, she's creating a god and letting, kind of a human being ride it, because she's summoning this force, this godly force, into Saturday to give him the power to disrupt what's going on with the story. And this is why at the start of the story she's making this weird sort of scarecrow-like figure with the top hat and tailcoat and the cane.
And the mirror.
Yeah, that's right. And so Saturday goes off with this weird energy like crackling out of him to the ball.
And so the witches get thrown into the dungeon. Lily has them thrown in there and they're trying to figure out how to get out when Mr. Saturday arrives with all of his supernatural force. And he's like tears down the wall, I think, of the castle.
Yeah, that's right. Rips the wall out so they can escape.
Casanana's been out there sort of like serenading.
Yeah, he's just like not really helping the situation that much.
No, it's true. But it is one of those things. It's like, how are you looking in through the window? He's like, I always know where to get my hands on a stepladder. But there's also that great thing where Nanny's just automatically translating what he's saying, and it's pretty much accurate. And you're like, oh, like we've been laughing at your nonsense language all the way through this book, but actually there's like 2 or 3 points where you realise she actually does understand these other languages somehow.
Well, I mean, that's like how you acquire languages, right? Like you just keep making mistakes until eventually you get the confidence to know how to say things. And that's not an endorsement of how to talk to people in other countries. No.
But she does, just throw herself in without shame or embarrassment, and therefore she opens herself up to opportunities.
Yeah, but they are...
to learn.
Yeah. One thing we haven't mentioned is that Nanny's postcards that she's been writing home.
Oh,
which
yes.
I love so much. So I'm a huge fan of postcards. And I really appreciate that when she's writing the first one, there's a footnote that says she wrote lots of cards and sent them all, but they all arrived after she got back. And I'm like, yeah, that's totally what happens.
I got a confession with the whole like Baron showdown and things going a bit wonky and he's a bit too powerful and Mrs. Gogol was like wanting to go a different way. That kind of washed over me because I was like, too much is happening at once. I've been used to the slow pace and I was kind of like, oh, well, bad stuff's happening, but it'll be fine.
Yeah, it does. I mean, a bit like some of those earlier books when we were saying we felt the ending felt a bit rushed. There are elements of the ending of this book where I think the final confrontation with Lily and Granny feels pretty good. I don't think that feels too rushed, but a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah, he has to get like Mrs. Gogol out of the way, essentially, of the narrative so that Granny and Lily can have their confrontation. So it's sort of like, okay, well, she's obviously, put a stake in Lily and wants to exact her revenge, Mrs. Gogol. So how do we get rid of her so that Granny can have that confrontation instead? And it's basically Granny and Mrs. Gogol have to have like a witch showdown.
Yeah. Although I quite enjoyed the showdown between Lily and Baron Saturday that happens before that. He's a zombie, but he's now got the power of a god. And she tries casting all this magic at him and it just sort of bounces off him. And then she like casts this big spell which sort of sucks all of the magic that's around out of the thing. So Grebo, who's fighting with guards at that stage, turns back into a cat. And
still wins
because now he's got twice as many sets of claws. And the duck turns back into a frog, who then the Baron just immediately steps on and squashes. There's a lot of that goes on in this book, isn't there?
Animals.
It's pretty rough. Although he seems like, he wants to be the prince of the realm and rule, and like he seems okay with all of the things that Lily's doing. So he seems like he's in on it. It's still pretty rough.
And you also know that someone's going to die significantly as well because death has been showing up like for about half the book.
Yeah.
Like when they were having drinks.
Ball, yeah.
No, but earlier, like when they're having drinks and Nanny passes over a drink and his death is having, he's like, thank you in his font.
Oh, yeah. And she like sort of clocks who he is, but then goes back to what she's doing.
Yeah.
And at the ball, he's like eating lobster. And it's like, oh, you've got really fancy taste, Death. Like, go straight for the lobster. Nice.
It's kind of like when you have a job where you get invited to fancy things that aren't really your thing, but you get to go to them.
He's stealing like tea bags to bring home.
Which I imagine happens to Death all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Baron Saturday kills the duck. The frog is dead. Long live the frog. And then just they decide that Embers is going to be the queen anyway. And that's when they kind of drop the thing where she's their daughter. And you're like, well, that came a bit out of... It's sort of hinted at a little bit earlier on, but you're like, look, I get that that's interesting and kind of that's your motivation. But also kind of, again, I didn't feel any weight to that when it turned up.
Because they'd said that Ella was his daughter earlier on,
right.
And they'd said that Mrs. Gogol was his lover or his girlfriend or whatnot earlier.
Have they said that? Oh, I must have missed those bits. I mean, I got the impression that was what was going on.
But they hadn't connected them together in that way. They weren't like, she's the mother of this. So,
and I think like Granny mentioned that part of why Lily wants Ella to marry the duck is so that the duck has a legitimate seat to power.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. Like it's sort of dropped in and it doesn't really, again, it's more of a narrative kind of device.
Yeah.
I was like, whatever.
Yeah.
But Lily runs away back to her mirror chamber so she can summon more power or escape. And Mrs. Goggle's like, right, I'm going to get her. And that's when Granny and Mrs. Goggle have their showdown because Granny's like, no, you're not. You leave her to me. You've got what you wanted. And that's also where they sort of have that bit of discussion about, is she good or is she bad? Like, is Mrs. Goggle, where is she? And they kind of give the idea that if Granny Weatherwax is like a, for want of a better term, a white witch, and Lily Weatherwax is like a black witch, like a black magic practitioner, then Mrs. Goggle's somewhere in the shades of grey in between. That's kind of how it's described in the book. Is that accurate? I don't know how we feel about that.
I mean, I think that Granny sort of objected to the idea that she would be ruling in some way or even like influencing Ella's rule as her mother. And she's like, no, witches don't do that. Witches don't rule because too much power can be abused really easily. And I think that's why she's, but yeah, I do remember that there is like a lot that's said about whether or not she's a shadowy sort of witch, which I don't feel like is really that kind of explored in the book at all, except that she raises dead people. Like, but
that seems pretty normal for her. Like,
yeah, like
and it was her
not,
boyfriend. So
yeah, you know, like it's not. I don't know. Like maybe when we read it, it's sort of just like not as weird.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, the showdown though is great between the two of them, particularly the way that it's resolved, because they sort of, first of all, they just sort of like argue with each other, but then Granny challenges to like a magic off basically, except she's not going to use magic. And she's like, oh, what, my voodoo against your headology? And she's like, yep. And you're like, okay, well, that's not going to go well for you because look what I've got. And she's got a voodoo doll of Lily. She says, but like, I could easily make it of you. Don't make me do it. And she's got like a little sliver of wood. And Granny's like, you do whatever you think is best. And starts walking up the stairs. Mrs. Goggles starts stabbing it. It's definitely having an effect. Granny's like going, and walking up. But she keeps going until she sort of can't get too far. And Mrs. Goggles threatening to stab the voodoo doll in the heart and kill her. And that's when Granny sort of plays her cards and turns around and then thrusts her arm into one of the torches on the stairwell, and the voodoo doll catches a flame. And she's like, "We ain't going to use any magic." She's like, "She didn't. She made you use your magic." And you're like, oh.
And it's exactly the echo of the argument that Magrat and her had earlier, when Magrat was talking about in the books, there's other people using magic, like walking on flames and not getting hurt. And then Granny's like, people can't walk on flames and not get injured. And so,
Yeah.
Oh, good
Yeah,
callback.
she just channels it into something else. It's not that.
Yeah, because that was the whole thing about not using magic when you don't need to. So, yeah, it just sort of tied up hers and Magrat's argument as well at the same time.
Yeah, that was cool. And then we get to the final confrontation of the book, the really big climax, which is Granny and Lily confronting each other. Or, well, really, Granny confronting Lily, because Lily's kind of running scared at that point because she's been defeated once already.
Yeah.
And it's in the Chamber of Mirrors. And this, like, the argument that they have with each other, like when Granny gets real angry and she says that great thing where it's like, you ran off and did whatever you wanted, and that meant I had to be the good one.
Yeah.
She so resents it.
It's so personal. It's not like a moral thing at all. She's just like, I didn't get to have the kind of fun that you did, or like, I didn't get to have the freedom that you did, right?
Yeah, it's just that I was the one who had to stay. It's the prodigal son kind of thing, but not quite. But yeah, had to be the one who's responsible at home, looking after things, doing the good things.
Because I think in their previous confrontation, they had these arguments about what being a witch is, right? Like, and Granny is very much like the here and the now and the real, and, you know, you can only help people by skin is a phrase that gets repeated through the book about like actually helping people with your time and your effort and your energy.
Yeah.
Obviously Lily is very much the opposite of that, where it's just like, I will use magic to just change everything around me into the way that I see it. But this argument I feel like is more emotional because it is like just that resentment of the younger sibling to the oldest sibling.
Yeah. And actually, you mentioned that the thing that Nanny says, you know, when she's talking to Magrat about how, no, she does like heaps, like, so what, she doesn't use magic, she does so much work. And Magrat not getting it, I felt was like, I think that was something else in this book for me, that there's always something about Magrat's attitude about using magic more and not getting that the practical side was just as important, if not more so. I never bought that from her. I think that sort of put me off about...
When I reread this, I really sympathized with Magrat. She's sort of like every mid-20s person who's having like a career crisis, you know? Like, what is this even about? Like, what is witching even about if I can't like turn something into a frog, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like, yeah, but I do agree that her inherent practicality is kind of dumbed down here to sort of further the plot a little.
And that's always been a weird sort of clash in the way that she's been characterized, because she does love all the sort of weird new agey trappings of modern witchcraft, but also she's super practical because the witch who taught her was a research witch. So when she makes like potions and like medicines, she's actually doing herbal medicine. Like, she knows how all that stuff works. So she's also kind of a scientist.
One of the things that she's frustrated by is that Nanny will just give them like some hot soup and tell them it's okay, and Granny will just be like, I'll just sleep it off for like, 2 weeks. And that often that works just as well as her very well researched herbal remedies. And I think like she's trying to find a place to practice her witchcraft in a way that doesn't feel like it's in comparison with these witches. Like I wonder if maybe when the witches get together, all of their insecurities get brought out more.
Reflected and amplified as though in a mirror.
Oh, how perfectly apt.
Oh, what a good segue.
But like, I think that's what you're saying. They sort of bring out the worst and the best, but the worst in each other.
Yeah, and that's the thing as well, that's why they have to be away from the final conflict with Lily as well, and Nanny recognizes this, they're her like Achilles heel or Sortian knee or something.
But then they show up anyway, Sortian knee. Sorry,
but then they run away. Well, they leave, right?
Yeah.
Granny has her in her sights basically, and then the other witches are around. She's like, oh, well, I'll kill them. And so Granny sacrifices herself for her
That's why she jumps off the tower with her broomstick in hand.
Yeah, her crap broomstick that needs a run up that they've very carefully told us a lot across the book.
Well, because she's still got all her mirror powers. Because she does all this magic that's more like wizard magic when she's fighting the Baron, and then when Nanny and Magrat show up, she just throws them against the wall and is like, "I'm going to kill," like a bit like Darth Vader, really.
It's just the craft.
And then that's what makes Granny throw herself off the edge.
And then she comes back.
Yeah,
and she smashes one of the mirrors
because she's on her. She's got her broom with her.
Yeah,
and she pretends that she's lost. And it's that thing where right at the start, before Desiderata dies, she says one of these Weatherwaxes is going to have to learn how to lose. But of course, she's not giving in at all because she manages to start her broom on the way down. And I love that when Magrat and Nanny are sort of talking about it, and Nanny's like, "How fast do you think you would go when you're falling? Is it fast enough to start the broom?" And she comes back, and I don't know. I thought it was quite cinematic.
And I really liked how Magrat and Nanny are going down the stairs, and coming up the stairs is Death, and I'm like, oh no, what's happened?
Yeah.
He's probably just getting some more lobster before he's needed a bit later on. Does Death ever meet Grebo at any point?
No, not in this book at least.
But in any of the books? Because I would...
Oh, yeah, I do. I was wondering about that because, he loves cats generally, but...
Would he love Grebo?
Don't know.
I mean, you have to love all cats, even if you hate some of them.
But that's, Granny has snuck back in, flown in a broom. I'm not quite sure how she sneaks in on a broomstick, but she manages it somehow and smashes one of the mirrors and stands behind it. And
just yells at Lily, like it's a domestic fight. And Lily's like, we have to find the other one. We have to smash the other one in the pair, because what's happening is that cracks are reverberating all around the infinite mirrorverse, following the curve of light, and it starts to come back. And as it reaches the mirror,
her reflection reaches out.
Her reflection reaches out.
Drags
Yeah.
her in. Yeah.
It's so creepy.
Yeah. And that's where Death gets involved.
Yes. Because Granny tries to go after her.
Yeah.
And that's
tries
really
to reach
affecting
into
as
the
well.
mirror. Yeah. And it's kind of, you had to piece together a little bit. They don't explicitly tell you what happens, but it becomes clear that she's tried to reach into the mirror to go after Lily, but has just succeeded in cutting her arms up to ribbons. But then her soul has gone into the mirror, but her body has stayed outside, whereas Lily is also physically trapped inside the mirror world. The space between mirrors, or however it's described. There's a couple of really nice evocative descriptions of mirror magic early in the book that I really liked. And Death visits them both. And there's all these reflections everywhere. And Death says to Lily, you're here. And she's like, how long do I have to stay here? Oh, she says, no, am I dead or alive? And he's like, well, somewhere in between. And he's like, how long do I have to stay here? And he said, well, until you figure out which one is the real one. And Lily looks around, there's all these reflections. She's like, oh. And then he says the same thing to Granny, and her response is one of the best things in the book. Granny asks, is this a trick question? Dad says, no. Granny looks down at herself. This one, she said. I'm like, yes. What else would she say? It's so good.
Yeah, she's so good.
And then that's pretty much it. There's literally 4 pages of the book left after that to wrap everything up.
Happily ever after?
Yeah.
Well, they're flying home, and they're trying to decide if they want to go see the elephant.
Yeah, and eventually they do, but they go home, but they go the long way so they can see the elephant. And just before that, the other thing that happens is Magrat throws away the wand. She throws it into the swamp.
Just a part of me that's like loves museums and history. It's just like, why are you doing this to this artifact, throwing it into a swamp? Like someone will find it down the tracks. What happens to Lilith's wand?
I think it gets sucked with her into the mirror world. Yeah, I think she's still got it at the end.
So maybe that's a symmetry thing. Like if one's gone, they have to both be not out of commission. That could be kind of like...
Yeah, well, that makes sense because if there's only one and someone gets a hold of it, well, who can oppose them? Whereas if there's two, then at least like there's a chance that if someone's using one for evil, someone else can use the other one to counter them. So
the balance thing, maybe that's why story-wise it has to go. But
It needs to be kept in a glass cabinet somewhere.
yeah, studied maybe like in a drawer at like a museum, and people can like get a fellowship and look at it through glass.
a fellowship. You know, it's interesting you should
MRI
say
it
that because I was just thinking that the wand has yellow, like silver and gold rings on it, and maybe that's what the frog-like creature with a birthday was after. And just like a certain other artifact, it is thrown into a river and lost for a time, but surely it will make itself found when it wants to be.
The Smeagol's of Destiny.
That brings us pretty much to the end of the book. Are there any bits that we've missed out, or any particular things that people wanted to read out? Any favourite bits?
I just had an observation first off, where they're talking about, I think, the circus, and Nanny says that they always promise an elephant and there never is one, and I'm always disappointed. And I wonder if that's because they're all busy being shepherded up for moving pictures.
Yeah, there's none left anymore.
And I liked in one of Nanny's postcards, she talked about how Magrat had taken ill and had a diarrhea.
Oh, yes.
That was quite good.
That was very
apt. Magrat's talking about how Granny did all of those things that she had during their trip, scoffed as not real magic, like, putting her hand in the fire. And Nanny says it's all according to the general and the specific, right? It means when Esme uses words like everyone and no one, she doesn't include herself. Magrat says, when you think about it, that's terrible. And Nanny says that's witchcraft, up at the sharp end. Right? And it's like, that's so, like, it's really interesting to me that, like, Granny occupies that really pointy end of witchcraft. That one where it's just like, it is about you and your own discipline and your own control, and that's why it's so important for her to like know what the real world is, because she knows she's going to be put into those situations sometimes where she has to only rely on herself, like in the Mirrorverse, right? Like she has to know what is real and what really matters. I just feel like, that's why she's so epic and great.
She would do great in Inception.
She would never.
That would be so good.
She wouldn't even need a spinning thing.
She'd just like hit Leonardo DiCaprio over the head.
Yeah.
Just be like,
that movie would have been 5 minutes if she was in it.
Well, I think now is probably when we want to get onto our listener questions, because we had a few sent into us via social media. What's the first one, Liz?
So this one's question is from Jonas Larson, which says, Witches Abroad reminded me of the Rincewind novels, a road trip consisting of a long series of comical scenes and parodies, in this case Red Riding Hood, Wizard of Oz and the like. Do you think the concept worked better here, and why?
It was as much a parody of kind of a European holiday as it was of fantasy stories. And because it was fairy stories, it felt a bit different in tone. And we all knew what was going on. Like when they encounter those stories, that's part of the plot. Whereas in something like The Colour of Magic, where they're going to sort of weird places like the Temple of Bel Shahamroth or, the Wormberg or somewhere weird like that, those are more pastiches or parodies of kinds of fantasy, and some of them quite specifically of particular fantasy stories. But those are things that, unless you're well mired in that fantasy tradition, you won't know. And the parody, or the things being like another story that you've read but not quite right, is not part of the story. It's kind of the way the story is being told. So for Rincewind, like the Temple of Bel Shahamroth is really just the Temple of Bel Shahamroth, and the Wormberg is like a bunch of people who have dragons, and it's weird and creepy.
And by weird, Ben means W-E-I-R-D, not W-Y-R-D.
yeah, as you said, everyone's kind of heard of fairy tales, so it's a very easy entry point into this particular kind of story. And as I mentioned before, I just feel like the dynamic between the witches makes it really fun to read. yeah, I mean, like, I didn't like the Rincewind books, but that was only because I think I read it at that particular time and it didn't really resonate with me.
Well, the tone is very different as well.
The tone, yeah.
I mean, I think the other thing that you just made me think of is that the witches are protagonists and they're on their way somewhere for a purpose. Whereas particularly in the first couple of Rincewind books, they're just kind of wandering. And I think that's the bit that most reminds me of a Rincewind book is probably the sort of weird Dracula section in this book where they're kind of really oblivious to what's going on.
That's interesting that, yeah, you're talking about them being a protagonist because this book does feel kind of like a midpoint between some of Pratchett's earlier parodies and his later books, right? Where he has a very clear, I think, moral message. I think it's pretty reasonable to say that the moral message of this particular book was hammered home quite strongly. Yeah, and I think he was still kind of working it out, like getting that balance right between a really captivating story and particular sort of message that he wanted to impart and also parody. Like I think in this one maybe, yeah, it's just a bit unbalanced.
There's a lot of competing goals for the book, yeah.
For a very slim book as well.
Yeah.
And this one's from Ilbion with the blending of folklore. So Baron Samedi, Baba Yaga and Cinderella. Pratchett shows an appreciation for all culture stories. What do you think he wanted to show by casting these together?
I think partly it's to show that there's all kinds of stuff happening on the Discworld, you know, and also because by creating this fantasy world where all those things can coexist, he can just sort of draw from that vast palette of all human stories and mash them together in new and interesting ways.
There are probably story elements in there that I am missing because I do, like, you know, I grew up in kind of a Western fairy tale tradition. So I imagine that, yeah, he's always done so much research into his books that there's probably references there that I'm not getting. I think it also comments on, I guess, the universality of these sorts of stories. Like there's some variation of a Cinderella story in a lot of different cultures, right? So, yeah, I think that's why he mishmashed everything to kind of not make it feel too specific to one place.
And I agree with the idea about it being universality of stories because it's the idea here is that stories are happening all the time. They have their own sort of reality. The idea of drawing from all kinds of different stories, the fact that we all have them shows this idea that there's something else maybe going on around the edges. Like, I'm not saying he literally is saying that, but it ties in well with the themes of the book to not have them all from one place. So we've got one from Murphy Peoples, which is, can you answer the question of the ages? Which is better, cats or dogs? Specifically, are you Team Grebo or Team Gaspode? Although I think I'm Team Ook, to be honest. All right.
Well, look, that's tempting, but I feel like Team Ook is cheating because he's a person, really. I'm Team Errol because if you're going to pick a pet from the Discworld, I'm not going to pick a dog or a cat. I'm going to pick a dragon. Like, I would love to have a pet swap dragon, but yeah, I can't choose between Grebo and Gaspode, except I can. It'd probably be Gaspode or Grebo. No, they're both great. I can't do it. I'm Team Errol.
Look, my gut instinct says Team Gaspode, only because I am a cat person, but Grebo is a special kind of cat.
Yeah. He's mean.
He's really mean. Yeah, I feel like he would like traumatize small children into having like fears of cats, like a serious cat phobia, you know, in the village. So yeah, I love Grebo, but only from a distance.
Yes. What if Grebo's a person? No.
No.
But it's just interesting because neither Grebo nor Gaspode are by their temperament pets. Like they're not really, because like we have Gaspode running away every time he gets given a nice home, which he claims what he always wants, but he prefers to sort of live on the streets. And Grebo sort of, I think, reluctantly, like he knows he's got a good thing going.
Yeah.
With Nanny Og, who sees him as this like fluffy kitten, and so they have this kind of weird friendship. But neither of them are really pets, so like I don't.
It's tricky.
Yeah. I can't really pick one.
Okay.
But yeah.
Sorry, Murphy. We can't answer the question of the ages.
But I mean,
slides the question of the ages.
Yeah.
But who would I be friends with out of the two of them? Gaspode, definitely.
Oh, totally.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, look, and I think I do tend towards Gaspode for the same reasons that you give. Like, Grebo is not someone who you have as a friend or as a friendly cat. Like, I know all my favourite cats are much nicer than Grebo.
Grebo is someone you hire to murder your enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's a bad boy, you know?
And then he doesn't do it because you haven't paid him enough.
Yeah. Or he saw something like more interesting to do.
He got bored.
Yeah. All right. And I think for our last one, it's from Sir Sarah Dudley. Which fairy tale do you think would have been great for a Discworld satire that wasn't already dealt with in Witches Abroad?
I feel like a lot of the Grimm stuff would work really well.
Underwater Discworld episode.
Like Little Mermaid style.
Just underwater. Because there's a lot of underwater like mythology to draw on as well. Like you can draw on a whole lot of different ones from different cultures. But yeah, Little Mermaid is a big one.
I like Rumpelstiltskin because I feel like just having recently read a book about that was sort of based on Rumpelstiltskin, it's a good book about debt and about kind of learning how to pay your debts. And I feel like Pratchett would be able to spin like an interesting story about Glod or other dwarves into that kind of story really well. And I also think that it feels a bit more modern. Like I think if it were, I feel like Pratchett is really strong when he writes about cities, which is why the Ankh-Morpork City Watch kind of books are always my favorites. And so, yeah, I think you'd have to find a fairy tale that has those sort of slightly urban elements to it. So something where, you know, currency and money and has some kind of importance rather than just being about magic.
Yeah.
And that's all our questions.
That brings us to the end of the episode. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us.
Blessings be upon this podcast.
Thank you so much for saying that. I feel better.
I should have brought a potato salad.
It's okay.
Well, come down to Neighbourhood Books in Northgate if you want to come chat about Terry Pratchett in the store. We do actually have some Terry Pratchett books in our very kind of small space. So, yeah.
Okay.
Come on down.
I would expect nothing less. We'll be back next month, of course, with our next book, which, Liz, what are we reading next month?
Diggers.
I'm going to return to the world of the gnomes. I'm so excited. I love the Bromeliad so much. We'll be back then. We will announce our guest when we have confirmed them. We're still firming up those details, but we hope that we'll have you back listening again, just as we've enjoyed you listening to all of the previous episodes. If you have, I mean, who knows? Maybe this is your first one. But once again, we'd like to thank everyone who's been helping spread word about Pratchat. If you've liked the podcast, if you listen via iTunes or on your iDevice, we would love you to leave a review or at least give us a star rating. It really does help people find the podcast. But until we see you next time, may you not be turned accidentally into a pumpkin or glod.
Or a newt.
But you'll get better. You've been listening to Pratchat, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchatters Elizabeth Flux, Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guest Jackie Tang. Pratchat is produced and edited by me, with music by David Ashton of Sample and Hold Studios. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at Pratchat Podcast or on the web at pratchatpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag Pratchat12.
Pratchat is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrace. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.